Ya Allah, 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 Ya Allah. Ya Lateef, Ya Lateef, Ya Lateef, Ya Allah. Ya Lateef, Ya Lateef, Ya Lateef, Ya Allah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيبنا وسندنا وقدوتنا وأسوتنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. أما بعد, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to our esteemed guests, to our esteemed audience. Welcome again to another edition of the Karima live stream. And today we'll be talking about an issue that I think has really galvanized Muslim emotion in the last few weeks. I mean, near the end of Ramadan, we saw that attacks began on the holy precinct of Masjid Al-Aqsa and did continue. And though we've entered a ceasefire in the conflict, that resulting conflict, it's something that Muslims are now asking questions about in a way that they haven't asked questions about in a while, about the role of Masjid Al-Aqsa, about what it means to be an ummah, what it means to be united. They've seen the fragility of the Muslims all over the world in their response. And I just want to make a few opening points. I mean, the first thing is, today, though Palestine is at the forefront of today's discussion, it is not the whole of our discussion. The ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is greater than Palestine. We have Muslims in China, we have Muslims in Syria, we have Muslims struggling in the Central African Republic, Yemen. All of these places we're seeing an immense struggle that Muslims are having to undergo tribulations and hardships, as was prophesied by our Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But the idea being that for us, Masjid Al-Aqsa is a microcosm of a greater reality that we have to come to terms with, and we have to find in the best way that we possibly can, in the purviews that Allah Ta'ala has given us, solutions to. And one of the most important things, and I think the Muslims sometimes neglect this, and this is historical literacy, to know what happened before, how Muslims have navigated the realities that they've had to face. That, like Mark Twain, I think, said, history does not repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And so there will be moments that will have similarities to those challenges that Muslims have faced previously, and we take lessons from them. Like I remember Sheikh Uthman mentioned a beautiful quote from, I think, Imam al-Sakhawi, Man arrakha ahya, the one who commemorates somebody historically has brought them to life. And it's our idea of bringing realities to life that we can take lessons from. And one of the great things, I think, on what we've seen, and I don't know if people have been following very recently, locally we've had an incident as well, but in the UK, there's been a massive clampdown on school students who speak out against certain injustices that they've seen, speak out for the rights of the Palestinians. But one of the great things about our children is that they are being able, and I heard this remarkable thing, that the teachers are now struggling because the students have obtained a literacy and they are challenging their teachers on the realities that they know that the Palestinians are undergoing. And this is one of the most incredible things, that in order to navigate those conversations, we have to know what we're talking about. And that is, inshallah, what we're going to try and do today as a form of education that will allow us to empower ourselves, to strengthen ourselves as believers, and also to posit solutions. And a final point, and this is, I think, one of the great points, is even last week in High Wycombe, we had a rally for Palestine. And one of the most incredible things, and I don't know if you've seen this, I mean, we had Eid as a Muslim ummah in the UK together for the first time in a while. And then in the rally that we had for Palestine, all the madhahib, all the denominations, every sect united on an issue, which was the issue of Palestine. And it was incredible to see, whether it was people from a Salafi denomination, Sufi, Hanafi, whatever, it didn't matter. Everybody united for the sake of the ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so these are the type of themes that we're going to try and drive home. Ideas of unity, ideas of education, ideas of solutions, learning from history, inshallah ta'ala. So I'll just quickly introduce my guest. I'm joined today by a dear friend of the Karima Foundation, somebody that we've hosted many times, a teacher of mine and a mentor, Dr. Yaqoob Ahmed, who is a lecturer at the Istanbul University. He did his PhD at SOAS on the constitutional crisis in late Ottoman Empire. His expertise is Ottoman history. He's an Ottoman historian by profession. He's somebody I feel who, I remember I've said this before, but when I was with him in Turkey and I studied with him, he was somebody who gave us strength. He gave us confidence as young Muslims, and it was one of the most incredible things. And I have a lot of love and respect for him, not just because he's a Liverpool fan like I am, but that definitely does help the conversation move forward. Alhamdulillah. So Dr. Yaqoob is with us. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Yaqoob. You are muted.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm so sorry.
How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good, bro. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. And our second guest today is Dr. Sheikh Uthman Lateef, who we have hosted at the Karima Foundation before. He did a beautiful lecture for us on the life and times of Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahimahullah ta'ala. And Dr. Uthman Lateef is a senior researcher at the Sapiens Institute, a research academy that hopes to empower Muslims to face the philosophical challenges of modernity. And it has some incredible projects, and I definitely recommend people check those out. Hamza Zortzis and other brothers who are worth checking out there. He's also a fellow at the Royal Holloway University, and he is the Khatib at Stoke Poges Masjid in Slough. Alhamdulillah. And his expertise is on Crusader studies. His PhD was on Crusader studies, though I dare say his expertise is much, much broader than that, for sure. Alhamdulillah. So just to kick us off, I mean, a sort of an open-ended question. And maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Uthman Lateef, because your PhD was on Fadail al-Quds and the poetry that galvanized the Muslims to take back Jerusalem in the time of Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahimahullah. Why do Muslims care so much about Palestine? I mean, why does it mean so much to people? Why are we seeing people who we might even dare to say are not extremely religious, but Palestine suddenly brings forward a fervor that we never see in any other issue? And what is the foundation of that love that Muslims have for Palestine and the Palestinians?
He's on mute.
Oh, Sheikh, you're on mute. I'll unmute you. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan, for the very kind invitation and the chance to speak, of course, alongside Dr. Yaqoob as well. It's a wonderful opportunity for myself. I'm going to start, in fact, in a way that I wasn't anticipating to start, and I'm going to start with Mark Twain because you brought up Mark Twain in the beginning. Mark Twain, in fact, is somebody who was very, very important. In fact, if anybody knows, in the Congo Relief Association. And there's a point of connection between what you mentioned right now and the fact that you mentioned Mark Twain in the beginning. And that is that, Edmund Dean Morel was one of the, he was involved in the, I think he was a finance, not a minister, but somebody in the government of the UK who would travel often to the Congo during the time and reign of King Leopold. And of course, that was the Belgian colonization of Congo. And when he would go there, he would see, in fact, firsthand the brutality of that occupation, of that colonization of the Congo. He would see the way that, the natives were being forced labor, suffer severe punishment treatment if they couldn't, because they had to extract rubber and ivory, from the forests of Congo. And there's so much documented evidence, photographic evidence of amputation of hands, of amputation of feet, and this brutal occupation, of the Congo. And Edmund Dean Morel, in fact, would go and petition Mark Twain to write something, to raise the voice, to raise his voice and raise, attention towards the suffering in Congo. And he refused to do that. In fact, after several attempts, he then authored his King Leopold's Soliloquy, authored by Mark Twain, which is a remarkable short text, remarkable text. It's a soliloquy, in the voice and person of King Leopold, about how much of a tyrant he is. And in fact, that book became so important in the UK that it kind of, shifted the narrative in many respects, in favor of having a sense of empathic connection with the people of the Congo. And I think that therefore that kind of taps in exactly with what you're saying about why is there such a response today. Of course, there is something about, in a very basic sense, a sense of the power of empathy, which of course is subject of my second book on being human. Empathy, of course, is an extremely powerful emotion. You could say it's a sense of perspective taking with another. The fact that in the work of Mark Twain, this in fact is reflected in so many examples of the native people of the UK shifting their attention and focus on trying to alleviate the suffering of people of the Congo is a reflection. I think, of course, for us as Muslims, it's far more deeper and far more deeply entrenched than that, because this is a matter of aqeedah, it's a matter of belief for all of us. It is not that on the one hand, of course, we have such love and and belief in the sanctity of Masjid Al-Aqsa, the land of Bayt al-Maqdis, of Jerusalem, a land of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Aqsa, of course, everybody knows, at least it's the first Qibla, it's the second masjid built, it was a place of the Prophet's heavenly ascent, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Abdullah ibn Abbas says there is not an inch of Aqsa where a prophet hasn't stood, and an angel hasn't stood, a prophet hasn't prayed. And so there's so many virtues to that location. But then, of course, also having a real sense of feeling outrage at the level of injustice that Palestinians are suffering and have suffered for a long time. Remember, of course, you mentioned that Al-Aqsa is a microcosm. It's true, and Sheikh al-Jarrah, in fact, is also a microcosm of the macrocosm of what is apartheid and occupation. What happens in Sheikh al-Jarrah happens on a daily basis, and has been happening on a daily basis for more than 70 years in Palestine. And that, of course, is settler colonialism that the Palestinians are facing. And I think, therefore, that I'm very grateful in many respects. I think that the narrative the narrative is shifting. I think I'm feeling this for the first time in my life, perhaps, that I think that there is now kind of a global sense of and I use that word, interesting, the word outrage. Stefan Hessel, who was an Auschwitz survivor, he authored his book Time for Outrage. In fact, at the age of 90 or 91, he passed away some years ago. And in fact, he has a chapter called Outrage over Palestine. He says, the greatest indignation I have in the world today is for what's happening to the Palestinians. And so it's interesting coming from an Auschwitz survivor. And I think that kind of degree of outrage is reflected a lot in Muslim sentiments towards the brutal mistreatment of worshippers in Al-Aqsa, the sanctity, the site of importance itself, and of course the continuing dispossession, settler colonialism that was reflected most recently in Sheikh al-Jarrah.
Jazakallah khair. I mean, I want to chuck that question over to you as well, Dr. Yaqoob. And I think, I mean, obviously we know that it was in the time of Sultan Selim, rahimahullah ta'ala, that the Ottomans first took Jerusalem from the Mamluks. And so and obviously we see every time when something happens, Turkey is very vocal in its support for Quds Sharif. But not just that. I mean, in terms of the Ottoman consciousness, what was the high status, or what was the status given to Jerusalem and Masjid Al-Aqsa, and what are your reflections on the current, the rising, the galvanization of Muslim emotion on this issue?
Assalamu alaikum. So, I first want to say thank you very much for giving me the platform once again, and to share the platform with someone like Uthman. I'm really grateful for that. Before I start that, it's interesting, when the posters went out for the talk today, I got a few comments back on WhatsApp with people feeling a sense of nervousness. And so what came to my mind was the hadith of Rasul Sallam, where it says, do not let fear of people prevent you from speaking the truth if you witness it, as it won't shorten your lifespan or decrease your livelihood if you tell the truth or remind people about something great. And that stuck with me because it reminds me of my time when I was in Aqsa a few years ago in Ramadan. And there was a moment during the Jummah where the gates were locked off. We were bottlenecked into one area. And I'd never witnessed something like that before in my life. And water cannons were being fired. And an old amja, we say in Turkey, the uncle said to me, La tuqafu, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And he was smiling, and I was looking at him because for me, it was a nervous situation. I'm from the United Kingdom. I don't go through those experiences all the time. And then I remember going home, reading, picking up the seerah, something I read often. And fortuitously, I opened up on the section where Rasul Sallam and Sayyidina Abu Bakr were in the cave. And Rasul Sallam says to Sayyidina Abu Bakr, don't be afraid. Allah Ta'ala is sufficient for us. And for me, I need to stress that to everybody who's listening. Allah is sufficient for us. We have to have that sense of trust and belief in Allah Ta'ala and His deen. We have to pull together now. We can't be afraid of speaking the truth. We have to stand shoulder to shoulder and not abandon our fellows. That means not abandon our fellows in Palestine, not abandon our fellows Muslims around the world, and not abandon our fellows who are joining us in the panel today. We stand shoulder to shoulder to speak the truth. And I want to put that out there fundamentally for everyone to hear it, because I think now is the time to stand up and speak the truth and be brave. I think the demonstrations to some degree are an indication maybe for some people as a paradigm shift, but that's not sufficient. We're going to have to be intellectually brave. There is a sense of intellectual and psychological pressure, which is exceptionally violent. It's a form of intellectual and psychological violence that is very difficult for people to appreciate. And it requires a response in equal force. It requires an intellectual and psychological response on an equal matter in that sense. So from my perspective in regard to Islam, I say wake up at night and pray tahajjud, do wudu, pray for your ummah. And then I say get active, get intellectual, get competent, get busy, get going and be brave. Your deen doesn't only tell you to pray. That's one component which is important. But your deen is now telling you to pull together for the ummah. And I have to say this because we mentioned Liverpool today. And I laugh about this because I was saying to a friend of mine, my team is Liverpool. Whether they're winning the league or failing, that's my team. That's my team. That's the side I'm on. Your team is the ummah. That's your team. Don't ever abandon them. Don't ever throw them under the bus. Don't ever be afraid. And don't be afraid of speaking of Islam in that sense, or feeling nervous about putting Islam on the table regarding this discussion. You shouldn't feel that in any shape or form. And so I wanted to put that out there fundamentally, because I feel sometimes when we're talking about this issue that there is a nervousness intellectually and psychologically of speaking of Islam when we're speaking of these matters, in the fear that we might come across as sounding backwards, limited, or intellectually inept. That's not the case. Okay, so firstly, I want to put that out there, which is not answering your question, by the way. In terms of the Ottoman context, one of the things that I learned from when I was in Quds is that the Palestinians and the Aqsa issue are synonymous. You cannot separate one from the other. It was Aqsa which gave the region its Islamic identity. And it is the Palestinians who worship at Aqsa who are holding the fort. You cannot separate one from the other. If you remove the people from the region, then all you are left with is with an area for only the privileged can come to pray and visit. That's insufficient for us. And if you just leave the people without the area, then what have you got left? Because the point I've been making before is that this is not simply a stripping away of people's life and humanity. This is an attempt to strip away of the layers of history that exist in that area, of which Ottoman history is just one in that sense. And yes, it's true that Yavuz Sultan Selim was the one, in terms of the Ottoman context, who brings the Bilad al-Sham in particular. And I want to make this case because in the Ottoman context, Al-Quds was part of the area of Bilad al-Sham. Okay, so over history, we have disconnected Syria and the area of Bilad al-Sham from the area of Quds in that sense. And what we see in Ottoman history in particular is that these were interlinked as a way of creating a sense of connectivity. And then later on in Ottoman history, for sure, you start to see the importance, as Uthman has made out, in regard to the Ottomans recognizing that this was an issue of Aqidah. Okay, so fundamentally, I'm giving now a warning shot to everyone who's listening, that if we lose this, this is to the detriment of your Aqidah in the way that you called it. This is then not only a loss for the people in the area, this is a loss for all of us as a collective. And we would be witnessing something close to what happened in Andalusia. So be careful. Let us not go down in history as the people who witnessed that and did nothing. So I really want to put that out there because I feel really emotional about this matter, because I have friends who are from Palestine today who are listening. And, you know, and I want to make this clear in that sense, that we do not stand shoulder to shoulder with the Palestinians. We are Palestinians. Okay, every Muslim is a Palestinian in that sense. Understand what we mean by this, because we are part of one ummah. So I want to stress that before anything we start talking about today, because it's important for me in that sense. And now we can go into the technicalities, and I'm more than happy to do that. So those are my reflections.
I mean, that's incredible points, because, and that's very powerful, I think, because we had an incident recently where some children at school spoke out against the Palestine issue and were sent home locally. And I think a lot of people are becoming very nervous, because they will try to entrap you and the words you say. And there's a sort of linguistic prison that they've created, a linguistic maze that they will use to try to trap the Muslim. And this is part of their attempt to oppress us. But I wanted to, one of the things I really want to start off with is this idea of, how would I put this? It's the sort of the break in history that the Zionist state of Israel is. And this sort of malevolence, or this creation of separation between the Muslims and the Jews that's happened now, that people now suddenly have placed this idea of opposition between these two religious traditions, which was never traditionally the case. So before even we speak about the birth of Zionism and the Ottoman context, because that's where it happened, I was hoping maybe Sheikh Uthman, because I know you're an expert on also the Andalusia and things, but this, in terms of the Muslims and Jews and living in what Marshall Hodgson calls the Islamic hate world, how did they perceive each other historically before the break of modernity and the rise of colonialism and the development of the European settler state that is Israel?
Yeah, Bismillah, and Jazakallah khair for Dr. Yaqoob for really remarkable points there. Remember that this is not, the issue of Palestine is not to be, it's not to be limited, or not limited, but it's not to be projected as even a Palestine-Israel conflict. I think that's not doing service to this or justice to it. It's not a Muslim-Jewish conflict either. This is a conflict about colonizer and natives. It's about colonization of the land of Palestine. Muslims, of course, lived with Jewish people since the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and of course there is a long history of Bani Israel in the Quranic paradigm, of course, as well. In those historical moments that you're mentioning, there's some that of course are really striking. One, of course, would be Al-Andalus, like you mentioned. Before the Muslims even arrived in Al-Andalus, the Visigothic Empire was going through a civil war. But previous to that, from the conversion of the Visigothic Arians to Catholicism, and particularly in the Fourth Council of Toledo, previous Visigothic kings like Chintila, Ricarid I, were very oppressive towards the Jewish people. In fact, in the Fourth Council of Toledo, Jews were forced to be baptized, forced conversions. Jewish children had to be separated from their parents because they said they were going to become entangled in their deviations. When the Muslims arrived into Al-Andalus, they scrapped all of that. They gave the Jewish people rights, privileges, autonomy. Jewish people had their own ways of governance that was accepted. Jews became, in fact, governors in many precincts of Al-Andalus. And the most striking example, of course, is the example of Hasdai ibn Shaprut. Hasdai ibn Shaprut was the diplomat under the Khalif Abdurrahman III, the Umayyad Khalif Abdurrahman III. And so that's kind of a testimony there. And also, of course, you had Maimonides. And it's interesting because we mentioned Sheikh al-Jarrah. Sheikh al-Jarrah, of course, is named after Husam ad-Din al-Jarrahi, who was one of the physicians of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. And the other physician that he had, of course, was Maimonides. And Maimonides is known as the second Moses. He's probably the most influential Jewish individual rabbi, in Jewish history after Moses. And that's a reflection, therefore, of the fact that Muslims never had a problem with Jews. Jews, in fact, were respected as people of the book, as Ahlul Kitab. Muslims, of course, can intermarry with Jewish women. Muslims have a sense of respect, and likewise, Jewish people have that sense of respect for Islam. Jews respect Muslims for adhering to a very strict sense of monotheism. Jews recognize there's kind of similarities in dietary practices as well. Jews are allowed to pray in mosques, interestingly, and they're not allowed to pray in churches. We in fact had in our masjid, it's interesting, last year we had a Jewish young individual who would come when the masjid would open Fajr time, before the Jama'ah would come for Fajr, he would come by himself, enter the masjid and pray, at the front of the masjid, where the mihrab is, and the brother kid, they couldn't understand what's happening here, and he had his own kind of form of worship, but he would also prostrate, and then of course he was given permission to do that, with a sense of respect and understanding there. I don't think he comes anymore, I think because of COVID, but he used to come before. So we haven't had a problem like that, and even in terms of the Crusades and so Salahuddin, whenever the Christians took power of Jerusalem, they always expelled the Jews, or put limitations on Jewish practices, and so they subjugated them. But whenever the Muslims took power, they always welcomed the Jews, back into Jerusalem. And the same is of course is seen therefore in Al-Andalus as well. And this of course is stemming from the whole paradigm of al-adl, of justice in Islam. Allah in the Quran, he says subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamina bil qisti shuhada'a lillah. Allah says, O you who believe, kunu qawwamin, be upright and steadfast for justice as witnesses to Allah. Walau ala anfusikum, even if it's against yourselves or your parents. And so therefore you have a paradigm, you have a kind of the impediment of love in this verse. You could love something so much, it could prevent you from being just. Then you have another similar verse, which is like reflecting on the impediment of hatred. O you who believe, kunu qawwamina lillah, this time be upright witnesses for Allah, as witnesses to justice, and never let the hatred you have for a people swerve you from being just. I'dilu aqrabu littaqwa, be just, and that is closer to piety. And so therefore these points now, in the words, for example, of Maria Rosa Manicoll in her book Ornament of the World, and other historians and anthropologists as well, these are points of what they call convivencia, of coexistence between Muslims, Jews and Christians, with a sense of equity and decency, and fair practice, and so on and so forth. And this also includes the Christian people as well. And so I think that's was that your question? But I just forgot what your question was in the beginning.
No, that was my question. I mean, that leads me on very beautifully to, so one of the things, obviously Sheikh Uthman also spoke about the idea of Muslim Spain, is we have the Reconquista, Ferdinand and Isabella, and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And in that process, they are taken in by the Ottomans. And I think this is a good place to take over for Dr. Yaqoob. So we have this idea, and I think I'm going to try and get two questions in one here. So the Ottomans take in the Jews. And so I first would like to speak about maybe the relationship the Jews had. I mean, this idea, obviously, they had a very strong, they lived in Istanbul, they lived in the major provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Even till recently, a lot of the Arab provinces that have Jews there, that was because of those are the Arabized Jews. I think they call them Meherige, there's a word beginning with M for them. Those are non-European Jews. Those are like Arabized Jews. And so the Ottomans had this long tradition of protecting and preserving their Jewish populations. But there's also, and so this is where I want you to come in as well, there's a break in that, where at the end of the 19th century, you see the likes of Theodor Herzl and the development of the Zionist movement. And so if those 2 points, so the first one, if you could just talk about the Ottoman relationship with Jews, and then afterwards, what went wrong, essentially.
Sure. As you correctly pointed out, I mean, Jews lived in the Ottoman domains prior to the movement from Al-Andalusia in that sense. But it is true that, the Ottomans had no problems with Jews whatsoever in that sense. I mean, yes, I'm not going to sugarcoat and say there weren't tensions between communities and so forth throughout the history of Ottoman history. That has happened. But what we're seeing right now is an anomaly in regards to the comparison of what we see in Ottoman history. For anyone who wants to know that, you can see the works of Karen Barkey, who makes the case that when she uses the idea of empire, and she says under empire, you don't have these type of tensions, because the point of empire in the Ottoman context, we're not talking about the colonial empire, but she's using the term to explain the Ottoman context in that sense. The coexistence was fundamentally part of the fabric of the Ottoman domains in that sense. And Rifat Abul Hajj, who's an Ottoman historian, made the argument that one of the interesting things is, since the collapse of the Ottomans, not a single nation state has succeeded in creating a model which can replicate this form of coexistence without any aggressive tension, because the nation-state model doesn't allow that fundamentally first. And secondly, because of the entrenched culture that existed from the Ottoman period, it makes it very hard to then create something totally different in many ways. But you know what I found interesting is, if for some of your readers, and the reason why I mention these names and books, because they keep asking me, can you tell us names and books? So there's a book by Michelle Campos. It's called Ottoman Brothers. And she talks about Jerusalem in particular, and how Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived side by side as co-religionists. And that was important. And on many occasions, Jewish intellectuals were promoting and propagating in the newspapers the idea of protecting the Ottoman nation and the Ottoman state, and that they found it problematic and abhorrent at times, the idea that there could be emergence or a creation of an alternative state project, which would be to the detriment of the Ottoman state project, to the point that even the Ashkenazi Jews were saying that we wanted to be represented separately because we didn't want to be associated with that. And one of the interesting things is, when you look at Ben Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, they had Ottoman passports. They came to Istanbul, were given Ottoman passports, learned Turkish, learned Arabic. In that sense, you know, it's intriguing how the Ottomans, in that sense, you know, were able to accommodate people from around the world in that sense. And this is not me just apologizing for the Ottomans or being apologetic as a Muslim. This is me explaining that under Islam, there was a particular understanding regarding the Ottomans of safeguarding people from different religious denominations and making sure to the best of their ability that there can be some sort of coexistence. And whenever there were tensions, and this I saw this in my own work, whenever there were tensions, it was the ulama who came out first to make it very clear that this was unacceptable, even when Muslims were not in the wrong, to make it clear to the Muslims that this is not from our culture, this is not from our tradition, and that we must live side by side. And so the point I'm then making is about the point you made about the Islamicate, because Dr. Uthman is correct in saying this is not a Muslim and Jew issue. But for me, this is still an Islamic issue, in the sense that Islam is being stripped away from that area. So there's not just people's lives and people's property and people's livelihood that's being taken away. It's their memories, it's their tradition, it's their history, of which people lived under Islam. So I was telling you earlier that Allama Iqbal, he makes the case when I was teaching my students this morning, that he says there's two components of Islam which are important for the man of knowledge to understand. One is the religious aspect of Islam, and the second is the civilizational aspect of Islam. We focus a lot on the religious aspect, and we forget that the civilizational aspect of Islam accommodates Muslims and non-Muslims. In that sense, the Islamicate perspective of Palestine includes Muslims and non-Muslims. The violence is against both, because the violence against stripping away of the Islamic identity of the area is causing a trauma to everybody, because that's got layers upon layers upon layers of Islam in it. And so you're not just taking away people's lives, you're taking away their memories, you're taking away their history, you're taking away their food, you're taking away their language, you're stripping Islam out of that. And that's why I wanted to make this very clear to people, that this is not just about human life. For us as Muslims, we should be concerned that this is stripping Islam out of the area, because that's what colonialism does. It creates holes, it creates trauma, and then it has to be filled with something else. And so we have to be very careful in that sense. And that's a global phenomenon. But in Quds and Aqsa in particular, if that happens, then we're going to be doing the same, as I said, as we do in Andalusia, which is we go on the holidays, we cry, we feel a sense of shame, we romanticize, we come back, and there's a sense of guilt. And that cannot happen here. That would be an exceptional travesty for all of us in that sense. And so this is why I want to make that point. Okay, so this is maybe not a Muslim-Jewish tension, I agree with that, but it is an onslaught on Islam as much as it is on the people, because as I said before, the people, whether Muslim or non, have Islam ingrained in their fabric, in the sense of the Islamicate, where even the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Waqf, is in the hands of Muslims. So understand how deeply ingrained this is in the area. Understand what's being ripped away here. The very fiber of that area is being absolutely stripped. And so that has to be understood. And in that sense, history matters. For people like myself and Dr. Uthman, who are historians, we know this. And this is why then we have to ask, when did this begin? Where's the beginning point? It's not, the beginning point is not last week. It's not Sheikh Jarrah. It's not 1948. Where it starts before that. And we have to know what it was like before, with all its complexities, and how this is a sustained onslaught that's going to continue. This is not a ceasefire, okay? This is just a pause in the continuum of what's happening in the region. And Muslims should understand that. It's good that you demonstrate, and that emotion is necessary, but now it's time to intellectualize. And that means to understand the politics, understand your deen, and understand the history. So that's my position on it.
I mean, I don't know if you want to come back on that, Dr. Uthman, if you wanted to add any points on that specifically.
No, for sure. It's absolutely correct. I mean, the whole idea, in fact, of stripping away is so essential to this whole narrative, this whole discourse, because, when the, this is particularly, when you had the Nakba in 1948, that you had the depopulation, of course, of areas. And this, of course, is to do with the landscape. But, of course, the landscape is made up of layers of identity, as Dr. Yaqoob just said, and depopulating, therefore, villages and then transforming them into city parks and transforming them into forests, planting forests, therefore, to negate and hide the existence of Palestine in the first place, to transform them into Jewish settlements, even car parks, in fact. These things happened. And so, therefore, you have a stripping away of the landscape. But, of course, the landscape is made up of motifs, of symbolic codes, of presence, of people, of mosques, of religion, and so on and so forth. I discussed a book, in fact, I have an upcoming book, in fact, that speaks a lot. I have an interesting chapter, in fact, I've written called Landscaping Otherness and Challenging Frames of Nothingness in Contemporary Palestine, an upcoming book, inshallah, that's going to be released, inshallah, in July the 14th. But in the book, I discuss a book that was written, in fact, published in 1949, called Kirbet Kizeh. Kirbet Kizeh is a very famous text, and ironically, it was also taught, in fact, in schools in Israel, paradoxically as well. And Kirbet Kizeh, in fact, is a historicized fiction about the Nakba, about the Jewish, a land grab and stealing homes and dispossessing Palestinians of their homes and so on and so forth. But there's a very evocative lines in that book that really stick with me. One of them is that it says that, in these new places, in these new homes, even the walls will scream in their silence, because in these very places, lives existed, people breathed, people cried and people laughed and tears were shed and voices were raised. It's a very strong sense of empathy bearing, I think, in that text. But remember, therefore, so on the one hand, you have the depopulating of a native people already there by, Jewish immigrants, the Ashkenazi Jews who came, from 1882 to 1948, and they're populating, what is native, the lands of native Palestinians. But that's colonial. They're colonizing, of course, the land. And what makes it so haunting, I think, is the fact that that's one of the Salman Abu Sitta, a very famous Palestinian scholar, said that that the Palestine is unparalleled, in human history. The fact that you would have, minority, settlers or migrating to a land, and then, stripping the majority people of their existence, right? And so the point is that once this happens, the narrative begins that Palestine doesn't exist. Palestinians never were there in the first place, and so therefore they're using these euphemisms, of refugees, for example, or words like transfer, or words like present absentees, for example. And the whole narrative, therefore, is the idea that you didn't exist in the first place, and that's a tragedy. And so therefore, the idea is, for us as Muslims, the most important connection we have to that landscape is enshrined in our religion. That's the land of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the land of Ibrahim alayhi salam, of Isa alayhi salam, of Hannah, of Maryam alayhi salam. That's the land of وَنَجَّيْنَاهُ وَلُوطًا إِلَى الْأَرْضِ الَّتِي بَارَكْنَا فِيهَا. Allah rescued Ibrahim and Lut to that land. وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ الرِّيحَ عَاصِفَةً تَجْرِي بِأَمْرِهِ. That when Sulaiman alayhi salam was the heavy wind. It's a land of Dawood alayhi salam, and there's so much in that land. And of course, the Prophet's companions are migrating to that land, settling in that land because of the great significance and sanctity of that land. And so therefore, I mean, one of the main things that happened with the settler colonial project is to strip the Islamic identity, you know, from the native population, you know, to convert those mosques into other than mosques, you know. And of course, what is the most significant of all of this is the fact that we have right in the epicenter of everything, the Masjid Al-Aqsa, which of course for us is the third most holy sanctity. And the fact that something like this could happen to this masjid, and particularly in the great month of Ramadan, on one of the most important nights of Ramadan, is really, it's just shocking. And I think that, you know, the reaction that you had thereafter was a reflection, you know, of the gravity, the travesty of what that meant, you know, for Islam and for Muslims. And so I think that, of course, at the same time, you know, you also have Palestinian Christians who have also suffered, and it's also depopulation, you know, of their lands, and therefore there's a sense of solidarity that they have with Muslims or with Palestinians because they suffered in that respect collectively together.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Uthman. I'm just going to backtrack it because Dr. Yaqoob, you mentioned something about you have to know about the foundational history and the foundational politics of this. And this did not begin in 1948. Neither did it really begin in 1917. It probably began in the late 19th century. But let's take it to World War I. I mean, that's always a good place to start. And that's, I guess, I remember I was speaking to, it's one of the most, arguably, I think personally, from World War I onwards, is one of the most traumatic periods in more recent Islamic history. And it's a very difficult situation. Now, I don't want to give too much of an open-ended question, so I'm going to try and focus this slightly. But one of the things we're hearing, I mean, we had private correspondence, we mentioned this as well. The Palestinian flag is the flag of Sharif Hussein's Arab revolt against the Ottomans. This is without no ifs and buts, this is the reality of the matter. And whether they've co-opted this flag now and it means something different, that's a different matter. But in the formation of the British Mandate of Palestine, I guess there are three main parties that are worth, and I'd love for you to discuss, is that we have the Arabs, Sharif Hussein and his sons, and the Palestinians, I guess, and I'd love to know what the Palestinians' role was in that. The idea of the British, in that they did attack Jerusalem, I think it was Allenby, and that whole escapade that was carried out. And at the same time, you have the Ottomans, who are in a state of military weakness, who are unable, who tried their best, and Allah Ta'ala reward those blessed men who fought for the preservation and the protection of our Khilafah, but they were unable then militarily to defend the land of Al-Quds against the British onslaught. So I was just hoping maybe if you could unpack some of what happened in that World War I period with the Arabs, the British and the Ottomans. I mean, I'll tell you, because I was thinking, Mo Salah tweeted, and he's very dear to us, but Mo Salah tweeted about, I asked Boris Johnson to do something about this. And in my head, I was thinking, why ask the British Prime Minister? Well, it makes sense, because it was their mess. If anybody has to take more responsibility for the mess that the Palestinians are in, it was the British, because it was their mandate and it was them. And then in 1947, when Attlee, who I love for the NHS, but regardless of that, who, when he saw the going got tough, he abandoned the Palestinians, tried to chuck it in the lap of the United Nations and ran away. So I'd love for you to just unpack that, the British, Ottoman, Arab. A small question. I mean, you probably cover it in about 20 seconds.
Yeah, that's a scrambled egg there. So, look, I'm going to try to go into phases to try to make sense of this. In regards to the flag issue, because I may not cover all of it. So one of the interesting things is, I've said this before, about the collective amnesia that we suffer from as Muslims, and that our memories regarding our Muslim identity has a huge hold regarding the Ottoman past in this period. And so all the symbols, the rhetorical devices that we use are all framed within the sort of framework of the nation state, which emerges after the collapse of the Ottomans. So even in terms of when we see the resistance in Syria, the flag that's being used currently, which is the green flag, which is the alternative to the current Syrian flag, is the flag of the French Mandate, in that sense, in which there's the French occupation. So in that sense, I don't blame people who live there right now in regards to, after years and years of conditioning, to come to the acceptance of these symbols as the norm. That's exactly what happens. You use educational systems and so forth. And to just go back a little bit more, when the British in World War I, after the collapse of the Ottomans, we have two state projects that come into existence. One is the colonized state, which is the nation state. This is not something that people imagined in the region, by the way. This is an imposition that is put in place by the European powers as a way of dividing the resources of the region. So they create the nation state. And the nation state is a state of colonizing people. And as a result of that, the infrastructure, the systems, and the culture was never designed to allow the people to ever have a level of emancipation. And Islam was never allowed to have a fair deal or fair crack in that sense. Now, what Muslims did after finding ways of removing the occupiers physically is to find a way of amalgamating some of these symbols in that sense. But by then, the structure was already left behind, where they were still colonized people, just to a different foreign power. So the thing I'm trying to explain to you is that the current configuration of any of the nation states post-Ottoman has never facilitated or allowed any Muslim in the region to have any level of emancipation, because the state never was designed to do that. It was a state to colonize the people. That's one. The exception to that would maybe be the Turkish Republic, but then they colonized themselves. And the Israeli state, which was that it aligned itself and amalgamated with the activities of being the colonizer, right? So that's the exception. The Israeli state didn't want to be a state that embraced the idea of being colonized. Instead, it took the practices and the ambitions of being a colonizer, because that was the ambitions and practices of the power at the time, which were the foreign powers. And the only reason why the Israeli state is, up until this day, manages to maintain its integrity in the region is because it requires a powerful foreign power to uphold it. And that starts with the British Mandate. That's exactly what the British did. So not only did the British and the French create states that subjugated people by making them colonized peoples, it then facilitated and created a state which it supported to be a colonizer. And when you look at the works of Eugene Rogan, he says, Rogan calls it that Sykes and Picot was a product of greed at worst and double dealing. And he says that when he talks about Sykes and Picot, he goes, it's horrendous in the way that the Sykes and Picot was created. The Balfour Declaration, when we look at Rashid Khalidi, and I want you to read some of these Palestinian writers, Rashid Khalidi, Walid Khalidi, Salim Tamari, yes, the 100 Years and so forth. He mentions that in the Balfour Declaration, there was no mention ever of the Palestinian people or Arabs. So what you see is that from the offset, the British in particular, their designs were always designs to subjugate the region in this sense. And so what you have to do is you have to then also attach that to the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate, to the subjugation of the Holy Lands, to the separation of the peoples, and the suppression and aggression. Now, what's intriguing is I remember listening to a talk a few weeks ago about Syria, which is that the majority of the violence that the dictatorships practice in the region, they were replicating colonial violence, not Ottoman violence, by the way. It was colonial violence because the colonizers for many years, for a decade, was subjugating these people to use extreme violence to keep them under control. And so when the colonizers left, they still left that system behind. In that sense, when you have a construction in the region that is designed like that, there's no way you're going to be able to escape it. This is why I'm making the argument for people that maybe it's time that Muslims need to stop living in a continued present and start thinking about the future and have a different imagination in regards to what they want, because the current models and systems they have right now are not working for them because they're not supposed to work for them. In that sense, if you understand what I'm saying. And so this is what the British did. And so the British were never equal partners here. In many ways, the Arabs, I understand at times why they moved against the Ottomans. This is a complicated subject area, but the Ottomans' hands are not totally clean here. And so there is a conflict of interest that takes place. What they did, unfortunately for them, is that they fought, and they incorrectly believed that the British were going to be honest brokers. But look at all the documents that are coming out of the British archives. The British had never had any intentions of being honest brokers. The French never had any intentions of being honest brokers. The League of Nations was never designed to be honest to the Palestinian people and the region. International law was never designed to support and facilitate that people. And the United States of America just took the mantelpiece and continued. And so when we talk about justice, I don't need to be told about universal justice from the West anymore. I'm done with that. Don't teach me about justice, because the system is designed to subjugate people around the world. That's what's happening. So in that sense, this is why the history is important, because when you look at what they were doing, they left behind systems and structures which would never allow the people to emancipate themselves. And this is important to understand that. So this is why Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot, the creation of the nation state, the creation of the state of Israel, is just a continuum of a particular structure, which is a colonial structure of Western powers, and it's a continuation of that. And so, you know, we need to wake up and smell the coffee a little bit, you know what I mean?
I think those are some incredible points to be made there. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Uthman, on that front. I mean, we've spoken a lot about this idea of the European colonial settler state. The idea of the apartheid state has come up, which they really don't like, as in the Zionists don't like this being mentioned. And I guess my question is on two fronts there. We've spoken a lot about this idea of the system. And the system has this, there is this idea of if you look at moral psychology, there is this idea that systems can be created that can develop people to carry out the most psychopathic of actions. What's strange, I mean, number one, I wanted to ask, when you say the European colonial settler state, the system of European colonialism, could you elaborate on that slightly? What do you mean? What makes this, what's uniquely European, what's uniquely colonial about it? Why are we justified in claiming apartheid in the formation of the nation state of Israel till today? And the second thing, and I think this one's very interesting, because I know you write a lot about otherization and dehumanization and things, is the fact that this was the Jews, what they experienced in Europe. I mean, the Holocaust, to an extent, is a reflection of a tendency that was very pervasive through Europe before the Holocaust took place. Anti-Semitism was very rife. There's enough evidence. I've read Ilan Pape, who says basically that one of the reasons that the Protestants fought so hard for Israel to be formulated is because they didn't want Jews in their land anymore. They never saw Jews as indigenous population of their own, and they always saw them as others within that population. And part of their support for Israel was to drive the Jews out. It was anti-Semitism that developed the state of Israel to an extent, and this is Pape's argument, and I think it carries weight. But how could the victims of the Holocaust, to an extent, as a civilization, now carry out the most egregious 5 decades or plus of violence that we're seeing in the modern age? So those two questions. I did the European settler state, and how did the tables turn that the oppressed became the oppressor?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, of course, we speak about settler colonialism. We understand, therefore, that the immigrations made from the end of the 19th century until 1948 were made from Europe. These were Ashkenazi Jews, the Yeshuvi, who were migrating into Palestine.
Well, when you say Ashkenazi Jews, what do you mean by Ashkenazi Jews?
So Ashkenazi Jews are I mean, I don't know the exact, maybe Dr. Yaqoob knows best about the ethnicity, the exact ethnicity of the Ashkenazi Jews, but these are the majority who are migrating into Palestine. And of course, that was bolstered during the mandate. But I think the second question really is a key one, I think, in terms of my studies as well. There's a very good book by a man called Hajo Meyer, who is an Auschwitz survivor, called The End of Judaism and Ethical Tradition Betrayed. And his book, in fact, taps in very much to your question about, as a Auschwitz survivor himself, how could it be, therefore, that the Zionist perpetrators of the apartheid in Palestine are so distant and divorced from the golden rule about doing unto others as you would like done unto yourselves. I mean, this was Rabbi Hillel said these are the greatest models, moral codes, in fact, that Jews are supposed to live by. And in some respects, I mean, there's going to be this idea of the Holocaust was such a big event, cataclysmic event and catastrophic event in Jewish memory and in Jewish history. The Holocaust is just horrendous, that the level of suffering inflicted upon the Jewish people. Now there are of course ways in which Jewish people, some Jewish people, particularly some religious amongst them, would look at this event as a suffering that was perhaps a precedent to a kind of a great sense of renewal or revival or restoration of God's bounty and so on and so forth. And I'm sure there's many who would argue it like that. They would see, in fact, the creation of Israel as God's a great sense of liberation for the Jewish people after their suffering. But of course, this is very troubling, because it's something that's supposed to be so wonderful and liberating wouldn't be something that's so entangled and so bound by great sense of oppression bearing on the native people. When Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi recaptured Al-Quds, they had inscribed on the gate of Al-Aqsa the verse in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ, that we have ordained in the Zabur, after the reminder that the earth shall be inherited by the pious servants of Allah. It was an expectation that you need to live up to the standard of piety if you're living in like holy precincts like Al-Aqsa, Al-Quds, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there is cognitive dissonance. You might not know that in Jerusalem there is a museum called the Yad Vashem. This is the Museum of Holocaust and Holocaust memory. 1 mile away from Yad Vashem is the site of Deir Yassin. Imagine that. Just imagine that for a second. 1 mile away from Yad Vashem is Deir Yassin in West Jerusalem, right? Where the massacre took place in April 1948. One of many massacres that took place, and this was part, of course, of that of the possession of land and the slaughter of the people who are already living in that land. And so it's a difficult question. I mean, I don't think we can say something in a way that kind of, you have to remember that not every Jewish person, not every even Israeli thinks the same. There are many Israelis, of course, who would think back about their history as victims, or their parents or grandparents as victims of the Holocaust, and real, like Norman Finkelstein, of course, is an example of that. That very famous clip that went viral about the Waterloo one, where the young lady asked Finkelstein about why he's mentioning the Holocaust and Germans, and of course the words, what does he say? He says that it's because of the lessons that my parents taught me as victims of the ghetto uprising, the Warsaw uprising, ghetto uprising in Warsaw, and the fact that they were victims who died in the Holocaust. That is precisely because of those reasons that I can't stand by when I see Israel doing what it's doing to the Palestinians. I mean, there's supposed to be a sense of profound empathy bearing. If you yourself have been a victim of suffering, you wouldn't want to see that suffering on another people. So I think there's a few things here. One is going to be the kind of the political realization of the land, for the Jewish people, that the narrative would be, of course, that there's a sense of entitlement to that land because of the fact that they're Jewish people. And the other would be that if anybody is suffering, then nobody would have suffered more than the Jews suffered in Poland or in Germany in the Holocaust. And the third might be, therefore, that to prevent such a suffering happening all over again, that there has to be this level of aggression and oppression meted out against the native population. There are, of course, remarkable people from the refuseniks. I write about them, in fact, in both of my books, upcoming book and the one I've recently written. The refuseniks are ex-IDF soldiers who refuse conscientiously objecting to serving in the IDF. And in some of their accounts, in fact, they do reflect on the memory of the Holocaust. You know, that in our accounts we have the same kind of things being described about us. This sense of the Untermenschen, the Untermenschen, the Übermenschen, the Untermenschen were the undermen, you know, were the inferior, the gypsies, the Jews, the mentally handicapped. The Übermenschen were the upper men, the white Aryans, and then they say we do the same thing now to the Palestinians. We see the Palestinians as the Untermenschen, as gypsies, you know, as unemployed, you know, as unsophisticated. Here's another one, that the fact that they use the language of dehumanization, the psychology, vermin, rats, cockroaches is another one that's being used. In fact, it's being used a lot, for the Palestinian people. So therefore, there's a continuum. There's a cycle in that. The cycle of dehumanization is very typical, but it's tragic, in fact, that it's coming from a people, you know, who have witnessed so much horror. And not to say from all of them, but for the ones who are the perpetrators, it's tragic, because you would have expected people, you know, to have known better in that sense. So I think that there's kind of, you know, lessons for us to learn from that.
Jazakallah khair. I think that's a theme that maybe we could come back to later. But what I want to do now is, in Islamic history, there are two key points where the Muslims lost control of Palestine. The first one is obviously the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century, off the top of my head, I think, that took place, which was an incredible trauma, again, for certain people, and a lot of people actually didn't care. There was a lot of heedlessness within the Ummah at that time, and I'll probably come back to you on that one, Dr. Uthman, just to give Dr. Yaqoob a chance to come in. But the other fall is the one that we just mentioned, the fall in the time of the Ottomans, the loss of Palestine that happened then. So what I'm going to ask both of you to do is to talk about that. So if Dr. Uthman could talk about the fall of Palestine in the time of the First Crusade. But Dr. Yaqoob, one of the things you see is when Palestine is this idea before 1917, is the Muslims, there's this constant loss of territory taking place. The Muslims lose Bosnia, North Africa, Egypt. All of these territories are slowly taken away from the Uthmani Khilafah, notwithstanding great attempts by the great Imam Sultan Abdul Hamid Al-Thani, rahimahullah ta'ala, may Allah reward him immensely for his efforts in reviving the Khilafah, but he wasn't able to carry out. And then what happened later was, whenever the Palestinians would face an onslaught of the Jewish terrorists, the Zionist terrorist gangs, the Urgun and all of these other things, they would look to see, could the Arabs come in and help them? But the Arabs were so weak at that point that there was no military intervention that would come in to help them. There's this idea now that I really want to focus on, the weakness of the Ummah, politically, militarily, that then left the Palestinians on their own to face the onslaught of terror and horror that they had to then face. Why did this happen, and what possible lessons can we take from it? Dr. Yaqoob first, inshallah.
Okay, let me just unpack this. Sorry, I have to write these things down. My memory as I get older is not the best. Firstly, I just wanted to add on to Dr. Uthman's point, actually, about the dehumanization, and I want to connect this to the Ottoman case. The dehumanization, in my point as a historian, one of the interesting things about the dehumanization is to take people's memories away from them. Okay, and in regards to the Palestinians, why Palestinian historians like Rashid Khalidi become important, and Salim Tamari and so forth, is their history is being written for them from the outside. And as a result of that, it's important for Palestinians to be able to write their history, to give us a reflection of what life was like before. Because at the moment, the imagination that people have of Palestinians today in the mainstream Western press and Western mindset is the one that's constructed today. Because people, as I've said before, have a very myopic memory in terms of what they remember. And yet when you read the works of Palestinian historians regarding the late Ottoman period in particular, they make it very clear that these were people of intelligentsia. There was an intellectual class in Palestine, that these were people of civility, that these were people of piety, that one of the earliest libraries in the Ottoman period was built in Jerusalem by the Khalidi family, right? And so forth, that this was a city of learning, of networks, of ulama. And so it's important to understand what that city was, because what it was to what happened to it is important, because the language, as Dr. Uthman just mentioned, in the way that the Palestinians are reflected, they were also reflected in this way historically, because there is an argument that these were vermin that needed to be outed. They were uncivilized. They were cockroaches.
I mean, there's even an argument, I don't know, it's Golden Mayer or somebody who actually said the Palestinians as a people do not even exist. Like, forget cockroaches, there's a nothingization, if that's even a word.
And so in that sense, here the history matters, because if the history of the Palestinian people is just simply one of conflict, then the only thing that the history gives you is of conflict. It's important to go beyond the conflict, to remember who they were and what's happened to them, from where they were at to where they went. And what's interesting is Arab nationalism in of itself, because of the creation of the nation states, self-subjugated themselves to present the Ottoman past as a colonial entity, as a way of justifying the creation of the Arab nation state, which then in the memories of the young Arab and Palestinian in particular, skewed their own history in regards to what they were like. Okay, so this is important to understand that. So firstly, this is why I want to highlight that the history of that period, that the late Ottoman period in particular, as you mentioned, is important in regards, and there's a dearth of it in regards to Palestinian studies, and there's a dearth of it being written by Palestinian historians, and there's an absolute dearth of it written by Muslims. Okay, and this is not helpful in that sense. And so this is what I talk about when I say this collective amnesia. And so the dehumanization is not simply happening in the sense of what's happening now. One of the biggest problems I have is, as I said, the intellectual dehumanization, in the sense of taking people's memories away from them and then replacing their memories with something else, which is in the current social media age where you can just remember what's in front of you. You no longer have time to remember what happened in the past. Okay, and I've said this before in regards to the Quran, when Allah Ta'ala, he mentions to Rasul, what's he doing to Rasul? He's reminding him, have you forgotten who created insan? From the beginning, from the offset, the one who taught you how to use pen, he's reminding all of us, don't forget. So in that sense, the issue of remembering, first, I wanted to get to that point, is necessary. In regards to the Ottoman period, now we have a lot of problems here in regards to the late Ottoman period. I think one of the issues we have in the late Ottoman period is the ability of the great powers not only to subjugate and colonize neighbor states, but to make people believe that the inevitability of the superiority of the British, which would lead to the colonization, is going to happen. And then what happens is, once you start believing in the inevitability and you side with that, then the inevitability happens. Okay, so the first key thing is to make people become convinced of that. And so the British had succeeded in convincing many of the intellectuals at the time in the Arab provinces that the British success is inevitable. And the Ottomans worked very hard to try to sidetrack that. And it was very difficult in that sense. And then in terms of World War I, the problem the Ottomans had, a lot of people don't realize this, it's not machinery that cost the Ottomans in terms of the war effort. It's numbers. They didn't have the numbers. The British, as a colonial power, were able to take numbers from India. The French were able to take numbers from Algeria. They were the Commonwealth. They can draw soldiers from Australia. The Americans came and helped. The Ottomans had who? They were stuck. They only had the resources of their own people, and that was limited in terms of numbers. So when you look at the British, the French, and the Russians together collectively, the number of people they could put on the ground on the war effort was phenomenal in relation to the Ottomans. What's even more interesting, I was teaching a khutbah about Mehmet Akif to my students in Kütahya, who makes the point that the Austrians were in the side of the Ottomans, and when Jerusalem fell, there were celebrations in Vienna. And we were surprised because these were our allies. These were the people that were supposed to help us. So you can see clearly that in that sense, this was one of the issues that the Ottomans had. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was equally traumatic. Okay, the trauma, we don't talk about this often. The trauma of the collapse of the Ottoman center was just as traumatic. And then what we see is that for the Arabs in Palestine in particular, who are continuously trying to work with the new reality of trying to coexist side by side, that was never going to happen. And so to some degree, they fell for some of the plots and schemes of the British. And that's something we have to be careful of in understanding that the way that the World War I and World War II is packaged in England in particular, the Ottoman past is totally disconnected from that. And in World War I, it has to be remembered that the British were the aggressors here regarding the Ottomans. Okay, the Ottomans were on the defensive here. They were on the back foot. So it then becomes important to understand what was happening in that sense. And we have the British archives, go see them. Okay, this is not surprising. But the aggression and the loss of Aqsa was exceptionally traumatic. And you see Iqbal then trying to go to Aqsa and saying whether we can establish a new caliphate where Aqsa can be the center. And the Muslims in India, the shock in the system, what's happened, and the realization. And what's interesting in Rashid Khalidi's book, he says, for example, that Yusuf Dia, for example, and thinkers like this in Palestine were already foreseen. They were saying, listen, we need to be careful because this Zionist entity is going to strip everything away from us. Not today. This is a long-term project. They could see it happening from the inception, but many people on the ground were not listening. And so what happened, what's interesting, it feels like today that when speakers are speaking, their words are getting lost in the noise in that sense. And so this is the key here. So we need to find a way.
There's a Dr. Yaqoob, just to follow up on that. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, Theodore Herzl, they offered to buy Palestine in order to to pay off the debts of the Ottoman Empire. This happened, right? And why was this an offer that could feasibly be made? Why were the Ottomans so weak at that point?
The response of Abdul Hamid is not clear. This is something that we continuously see that emerges. The Ottomans were in debt. They borrowed loans from the European bank. The reasons why they borrowed the European banks is because the Ottoman Reformation, like state reformation, was dependent on funds of which they could not tax their own society to raise the funds to be able to compete with the European powers, who were colonial powers, who were using resources by subjugating people. So the Ottomans were at a disadvantage to be able to compete materialistically because they were not using the same means. So the only alternative option they had during the Tanzimat period was to take loans from the European banks. But as a result of that, the debt became very excessive because the European banks found a way of squeezing the Ottomans in that sense. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was exceptional in the way that he was balancing the books. But Theodore Herzl thought that, we could use this as a way of convincing Abdul Hamid that we can find a way of facilitating the removal of the loans. And in return, you give us Quds. And Abdul Hamid flatly denied that. But in fairness, that would have been denied by anybody in the Ottoman state, okay? That has to be understood here. It is not purely an Abdul Hamid issue. Any sultan in the Ottoman period, in any period of Ottoman history, would have denied that outright. Because if you read the works of continuous thinkers in the Ottoman period, Aqsa, as Dr. Uthman Lateef mentioned, was Aqidah for them. So they were going to, no chance. And when Aqsa was lost, it was a huge shock to the system in that sense.
Coming now to, he is Sheikh as well, so Sheikh Dr. Uthman Lateef. But he's on mute, so we can't hear a protest. That's good. But
I'm not a Sheikh. A'udhu billah.
Subhanallah. Dr. Uthman Lateef, I just wanted to now taking it back even further. So Sheikh Dr. Yaqoob talked about the trauma of the recent loss. Now, if we go back to the first time the Muslims lost Al-Quds, and I didn't even know this, I read this recently. It was in the lifetime of the great Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, who's carrying out this immense project of revival of Islam. This amazing intellectual output is happening, whilst at the same time, the Muslims are in such a decrepit state politically, militarily. The Abbasid Khilafah has collapsed 945. that the Crusaders just waltz in and they absolutely destroy everything and take Jerusalem. I'm just on that point, before we come to the Salah ad-Din and the revival, and I hope to get both of your insights on that, how was that even possible? How was it possible that the Crusaders could just come in and take Jerusalem? And what lessons, again, can we possibly take from the situation of the Muslims in the time? And also, I remember you mentioned last time, it was nearly 100-year period before the Muslims were ready to take it back. And so was there this lull, did they fall asleep? Was this like beautifully Dr. Yaqoob calls it, the collective amnesia, maybe collective insomnia would have been a better description of what happened in that 100-year period?
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I mean, it's interesting to know the fact that the genesis of the Crusades is Al-Andalus. I mean, that's where the first Crusades take place. The crusade is a crusade because of an indulgence provided by the Pope, for the participants in the crusade, a remission of sins. And so therefore, during the period of the Muluk al-Tawa'if, the party kingdoms, when the Muslims had divided into separate autonomous, small kingdoms, that sense, oh, you're famous now, Maria.
There's 50 people on YouTube who've seen her, 52 now.
Yeah. So the genesis of the Crusades was, of course, the fact that Popes Alexander III, Gregory VII, who came before Urban II, granted an indulgence, for participants who would travel. I mean, Spaniards essentially, who would fight against the Muslims and retake states of Tarragona, for example, defending the Church of Zaragoza, for example. And that same indulgence was then given in 1095 by Urban II. So therefore, the genesis, in fact, is Al-Andalus itself. Now, that's interesting because of what Dr. Yaqoob just said, in fact, and I wrote it down, where he said that Yusuf Dia had this sense of forewarning about what's going to happen to Al-Aqsa. In 1103, I think it was, when Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami, the great Shafi'i faqih, authored his first text, Kitab al-Jihad, which was the first scholarly response to the First Crusade, in which he forewarned the Muslim Ummah that the Crusaders are not only content or interested in Jerusalem. There is a longer project about Sicily and Spain and Al-Andalus, and they're seeking to expand even further. Again, people didn't take him seriously at that time as well. But going back a bit, therefore, so if you think about what's happening in Bilad al-Sham at this time, there was a year called the year of the death of the Caliphs. I think it was 1089, I think it was, where the Malik Shah, the Seljuk Sultan, dies. A month after him, his Wazir Nizam al-Mulk dies. The next year, the Fatimid Khalif dies. His Wazir dies. A month after him, the Sunni Khalif al-Mustansir Billah dies. Within a year, you have 4 or 5 of these very important political actors dying. I don't know if the Crusaders knew, in fact, about this, but they would have taken it to their advantage because the Muslim Ummah was kind of in some political disarray. Now, of course, there's a much bigger, longer discussion. I don't think we'll have time to get into it, about the reasons for the crusade, what we can find and read in the surviving accounts of Urban II's speech. But in a nutshell, of course, the Muslims were making good progress. The Seljuks against the Byzantines, the Battle of Manzikert, 1074, Alp Arsalan. This caused a lot of consternation, I think, from the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus, writing a letter to Urban II asking for assistance. Even though there was a schism, still the Byzantines are referred to as our Eastern brothers, the Eastern Church. That sense of unity was reflected in Urban II's speeches. Second to that, of course, was some accounts of coming from pilgrims coming back up into, or traveling to Jerusalem, coming back up and telling them about these negative stories about Muslim abuses against the pilgrims. You had the Fatimid Khalif Al-Hakam bi Amr Allah destroying part of the Holy Sepulchre. These were all used, in fact, as part of that propaganda. Very, very intense dehumanization of Muslims, of course, also in his speeches. Muslims are called heathen devil worshippers or worshippers of the statue of Muhammad, who sacrifice babies at the altars. And of course, remember that because it was an indulgence, he's speaking primarily to people who were thieves and brigands and murderers and rapists and thieves, and that sense of promise of forgiveness of sins and heaven appealed to them. And so therefore their march, you mentioned Al-Ghazali. I think it's quite ironic that Al-Ghazali's going through the spiritual transformation was also in 1095, actually, is when he traveled to Damascus and then to Jerusalem in the same year that the Crusade, in fact, was launched. Al-Ghazali does not have a very, it doesn't make mention of the Crusades, or his role is not explicit in that sense. Like he's not like a Sulami, for example, even though a Sulami cites Al-Ghazali because he's Shafi'i and it validates kind of his text and his argument. But why I think Al-Ghazali is important is because Al-Ghazali taps into this realization that there is an inherent problem with the Muslims, in his where he is, Tus and Baghdad, and he realizing that there is a lot of pretension amongst the scholarly bodies and among students of knowledge, and showing off, and that sense of taqwa is missing in what he's seeing, and that kind of he almost loses his faith. I mean, he's really taken aback by all of this. He has this transformation in that same year, 1095. And then, of course, he authors his magisterial Ihya Ulumuddin, partly authored in Al-Aqsa Masjid as well. But one of the things, in fact, that he's focusing on in Ihya Ulumuddin is he's recounting the virtues of the Imams, of the Ummah, to really show that you kind of antagonistic people, he's speaking to the students of knowledge who are so staunch in their being Ash'ari, or so staunch in their being Athari, or so staunch in their being Hanafi or Shafi'i. There's brawls in the streets of Baghdad. There's fights that people are even dying, because of this ta'assub that they had for, if you're Athari or if you're Ash'ari, people are fighting one another. And it was so detrimental to that sense of collective spirit of the Ummah, that he became sickened of it. He recounted the virtues of the Imams to show that the people that you're championing were not like you; they were very different, to you. And so, why that became important is because that idea really filters through, the schooling of Nizam, the Nizamiya madrasas, the ideas of Al-Ghazali. So As-Sulami, we say, therefore, that's the first account we have of a scholarly response to the First Crusade, calling on the Muslim Ummah to unify, to put aside their differences, calling on the Khalif, to make his Sayfiyah, the summer raids, to recapture Al-Quds and to save the Muslims, warning the Muslims about the bigger agenda behind the crusade. He even calls the crusade a jihad, which Western historians find so interesting, because he's using the same. I mean, he has the same idea. He knows that the crusade is much more than a crusade. It's more encompassing in the sense that it's a jihad. Crusaders were called Peregrini Milite Christi. These were pilgrim knights of Christ, who traveled with the pilgrim staff and the pilgrim purse. But of course, one of you guys mentioned the Inquisition. The motto, if you could call it, the banner of the Crusaders, marching into Jerusalem and slaughtering its people. In the account of Ibn al-Athir, it was 70,000 people who were martyred that day, was Dus Vult, which means God wills it, God wills it. In the Spanish Inquisition, in fact, during the this was the first Grand Inquisitor was Thomas de Torquemada, who took his ideas from Nicholas Emeric in the Directorum Inquisitorium. He had he came up with Dios la quer in Spanish, which means God wills it, God wills it. So therefore, that evil that they subjected the the Muslims too in the Inquisition was inspired by the likes of the Crusaders, who were saying the same thing, that God wills it to happen. In any case, it happened. You mentioned the point about amnesia. So we have the first, and I discussed this at length in my first book, The Cutting Edge of the Poet's Sword, Muslim Poetic Response to the Crusades. The first responses came from poets like Abu Muzaffar al-Abi Wardi, Ibn al-Khayyat, an anonymous poet, and their lines are very evocative. In 1099, the Shafi'i faqih of Damascus travels with a group to Baghdad, Abu Sayyid al-Harawi, and they learned the poem of al-Abi Wardi and they recited it publicly in the court of the Khalif. They even broke the minbar, because it was a Jummah. And the lines were كيف تنام العين ملء الجفون وعلى فوات أيقظت كل نائم وإخوانكم بالشام يضحي مقيلهم ظهور المذاكب, and it goes on. How can the eyes sleep at a time of disaster like this that would awaken any sleeper when your brothers in Sham are sleeping in the bellies of vultures? Very evocative lines. But one of the things that you'll see in the first response is not so much anti-crusade. It's not so much, because remember that they'd suffered from the Byzantines as well, plunderers and raids. They had engaged, of course, with them before, but it was more about a desire that we need to fix up the house of Islam. The house of Islam is suffering. We as an ummah are suffering because of division, disunity. Ibn al-Khayyat's poem, in fact, which is translated fully, alhamdulillah, in my book, he's speaking about these evil grudges that you have with one another. During the time when Al-Quds was being besieged by the Crusaders, the two sons of Malik Shah, Muhammad and Barik Yaruk, were fighting against one another, right? So therefore, that's just a reflection of the fact that, or it's symbolic of the fact that sense of unity had a detrimental effect on the potential of the Muslims to fight back against the Crusaders. But I mean, saying that, of course, there's other problems. There's the Sunni and the Shia divide as well. There's kind of, and there's also, of course, the fact that you had this political disarray that I mentioned. But that's not to say that there is, I think, an amnesia. I wouldn't say that, or even an apathy. I think there is an incapacity, incapability. The Muslims at that time, and particularly in Bilad al-Sham, you had voices like early texts like Ibn Qalanisi, for example, and there's a lot of cursing, of the Crusaders, and may Allah destroy them. There's that kind of sentiment of not being happy with their condition that's very there. This, however, is not fully true, because much later on, in the account of Ibn Jubair al-Andalusi, the Andalusian traveler who travels, from Spain, going through Sham and Egypt, and gets to the Hajj and writes his account, he felt a lot of dismay about Muslims who had acclimatized, adapted, adjusted to living under Crusader occupation and Crusader rule. And he was really angry with that how could you be happy to settle with these people who have done so much bad to you, and so on and so forth. And therefore, you have these kind of things happening. But the other thing, of course, to remember is that because of the fact that there was political disinterest in recapturing Al-Quds, what could the Muslims do? Right? There's a kind of a sense of, we might have a sentiment of our connection to Al-Quds is still there. We love Al-Aqsa, but our political body is just not interested in this anymore. Now, I say this, and I don't mean to sound as if, well, until that's there, we can't do anything, because it's incorrect. I think the power of popular resistance is very potential, very powerful. Always retaining and reigniting that sense of collective memory, of Al-Aqsa, of Palestine is very, very powerful and very, very important for all of us. And in fact, that was happening in those early decades of the Muslims. But what it took a single spark, in fact, you might say, in a political sense, in the 1144, when Imad-ad-Din Zengi recaptures the state of Edessa. This, in fact, transforms everything, because that single unit, that victory in retaking a Crusader state, allowed the Muslims to see, well, that's something, because now we can potentially potentially envision a recapturing of Beit al-Maqdis, of Jerusalem. The fact that we can defeat the Crusaders in a major Crusader state of Edessa means that things could happen, things could change. And even though it wasn't Imad-ad-Din Zengi that would carry on with this, it would be his son Nur-ad-Din Zengi that would really bring this sense of revival into the Muslim Ummah. Together with all of this, there is something that we call the new Sunnism of the Seljuk period. I mean, there's a new kind of current at play, and that is putting an end to these smaller differences that kind of are wasting a lot of your efforts, a lot of your energies, are weakening your resolve, making you fight against one another. Laying aside these kind of things, seeing your kind of collective sense of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. I mean, that's who you are as Muslims, and understanding therefore that your piety is of the essence, because your piety is a reflection of your closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah would give victory in tansurullah yansurukum wa yathabbit aqdamakum. If you aid Allah's deen, Allah would aid you and make your foothold firm, right? That's shartiyya, that's a condition. You have to do that. And I think Nur-ad-Din Zengi really lives up to this model. There were texts being written, like even Al-Ghazali has Nasiyat al-Muluk, and his Nasiyat al-Muluk was a text about advice to the kings. I mean, what is the expectation, the standard of behavior that people are expecting, or the scholarly body is expecting from governors and sultans and so on and so forth, level of justice and piety and being frugal and so on and so forth. Nur-ad-Din Zengi really lives up to that model. He's called by the poet Dhul Jihadain min aduwin wa nafs fahuwa tul hayat fi ajah. He's the one that encompasses two jihads, one the physical one against the enemy, one the jihad against himself. And therefore he's instructing his army to pray the night prayer. He's instructing his armies to eat less, to pray more. He's instructing his army to have a sense of kind of relationship building between themselves. In one of my favorite accounts, one of the poets once approaches Nur-ad-Din Zengi because he had these high taxes and people were struggling, and he says to Nur-ad-Din in very beautiful poetic words, very simply understood: Ya Nur-ad-Din, ماذا تقول إذا وقفت بموقف فردا ذليل والحساب عسير وتعلقت فيما الخصوم وأنت في يوم الحساب مسلسل مجرور وتفرقت عنك الجنود وأنت في ضيق القبور موسد مقبور يا نور الدين مهد لنفسك حجة تنجو بها يوم العاد ويوم تبلغ. He's saying, what would you say, ماذا تقول, when you're standing before Allah and your accountability will be hard on that day? What would you say, Nur-ad-Din, when you're in the depths of your grave and your army is going to depart and leave you? He says, prepare for yourself an excuse before Allah on a day when things are going to be very difficult and tough for you. And he immediately reduced the taxes immediately because he had that sense of pietistic sentiment about him. And that was really profound. And so therefore, a realization, this is stemming from people like Al-Ghazali, from the end of the 10th century. Ghazali dies in 1111, so it's quite early still, although he's seeing everything, but that's really what he believed, that there is a malay in the Muslim Ummah that needs to be remedied, and if this is remedied, it's going to strengthen the iman of the Muslims, and it's going to make people closer to Allah, and victory is more assured in that sense. And then of course there has to be a political response. There has to be a way that for the political ruling elite to be able to galvanize and to be able to unify and to create this sense of hope in the Ummah. Nur-ad-Din Zengi, of course, he realizes that there is a lot to be done, but one thing that he does do, I think, which is important for our listeners, is that so in the madrasas in the internal states of Syria, of Aleppo and Baalbek and Hama and Homs, he builds a lot more madrasas. So in Damascus there were 11. By the time he died in 1974, there's 22 now. But he's incorporating into these schools of learning teaching of Fada'il al-Quds, teaching of Fada'il al-Quds, of the merits of Jerusalem. This is a new generation who had not even been to Jerusalem now, right? And so therefore, to keep that understanding alive in their memory, so that they always have a sense of yearning of traveling there, settling there, fighting there, and so on and so forth, it had to be that it begins with education, to learning. So he's bringing back old books like Al-Rabai, Al-Wasiti, new books being written by Sam'ani and others. Ibn Asakir's a 70-volume history of Damascus. The whole opening section on it is on Fadail al-Sham, the virtues of al-Sham. Remember, the epicenter of al-Sham is Al-Quds, and the epicenter of that is Masjid al-Aqsa. Therefore, that's a program that's taking place, and it's really helpful to the whole cause. And then, of course, inspiring a sense of hope in the Muslims. Nuruddin Zengi, of course, builds this minbar. Builds a minbar, which was made up of interlocking parts, no nuts, no bolts. And the idea was that, when we'll station it in Aleppo, but when we take Al-Quds, we're going to bring it back down and have it for our first Jummah. He didn't live to see that. By 1174, Salah ad-Din would do it, but that's kind of a sense of inspiring a sense of hope and a vision that it can be possible for us to retake Al-Quds.
That's subhanallah. That was a beautiful rendition of the events and the relevance, especially this idea that you mentioned right at the end of the collective memory that was attempted to be revived through the reading of the text on Fadail al-Quds. I remember reading from Salabi something to do with the idea that Nuruddin Zengi had a very strong idea, and Imam Abdul Qadir al-Jilani rahimahullah and others, about the people of the Maqadisa, that they really tried, those people who, quote unquote, the refugees of Bayt al-Maqdis who came into those lands, they tried to teach them, educate them, make them a force in order to take back Jerusalem. Inevitably, even when Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, as far as I remember, Ibn Qudama is with him reciting the text as they leave, and they had this idea of the importance of Masjid al-Aqsa. And I do want to come back to Salah ad-Din, but that I think we'll do right near the end, about solutions and how Salah ad-Din can be mirrored in the modern age. But I mean, Dr. Yaqoob, I feel like I saw you diligently writing, so I'm assuming you've got some things you already want to share. If I could add one more thing to whatever those things might be, one of the things, if you could just mute yourself, Doctor, because it's sort of, there we go. So one of the things is, he spoke about when he was describing the situation, right, of the First Crusade and the Malays and the infighting and the disunity. You close your eyes and it's like he's talking about the modern age. Or
sorry, I've got to come back in just a few minutes. Yeah, is that okay?
No worries. Barakallah fiqh. And it felt like, because one of the things when Masjid al-Aqsa does fall, he's saying there's malaise. And one of the things even a brother put in the comments is that when all of this fighting happened, when Masjid al-Aqsa was stormed, when the occupation built up recently in a very horrific, violent sense, there was the silence from the Muslim states was deafening. What's even crazier is the ones who spoke out were like Malaysia and the Maldives, who are like the most tiny, well, you can't call them insignificant, but geographically they're not that meaningful. Like physically, they weren't going to go but they're the ones who spoke out. Whereas the states that people put vested interest in, maybe Turkey spoke a bit louder than others, but Pakistan, we were talking about recently, Imran Khan was putting a picture up of Noam Chomsky, as if Noam Chomsky, like we have Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, great men of our tradition who actually liberated Aqsa, and our conversation is revolving around what Noam Chomsky has to say about Masjid al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. It's a very sad state that people are seeing. And so even 1948 forwards, the constant attempts that the Arab states had in trying to take back the nation state model, who tried to take back through using the United Nations, all you see is failure after failure. Israel destroys them on the battlefield. They're too busy fighting with each other. They can't even motivate themselves to work together properly in a military effort and then they're fighting the people of Aqsa, and there's all of this infighting and things that are happening also at the same time. So I'd love to get your reflections on the parallels between that time and the current time that Dr. Uthman spoke about, and then whatever notes you have ready to share with us, I'm more than happy for you to pass on, inshallah.
So the notes I was just making on what Uthman was saying, actually, because I found what he was saying interesting, that I could ponder over tonight before I go to bed. And inshallah, I can sleep well, but I don't know if that's the case. But, it's interesting. Somebody who's invested in the region, who lives in the region and so forth. And when we see the demonstrations that are taking place worldwide, sometimes there's an assumption that the Palestinians are looking at us demonstrating in Western states and are having a sense of hope and belief. And yet, what I found living in this part of the world is we took hope and belief in the Palestinians resisting. It was the other way around. And there's a false sense of belief maybe in us, assuming that it is us who are projecting our support for them, when in actuality we are so dependent on them holding the fort. We are so dependent on them understanding what is necessary and what needs to be done. We are so dependent that when Aqsa is attacked in Ramadan, that they go all in Laylatul Qadr and pray all night. They actually understood what was necessary. In that sense, the inspiration comes from them. The inspiration comes from the people of Quds in Gaza, who are refusing to give in, knowing that giving in is easier, knowing that those of us who live in the West, Theodor Herz, he said something which was interesting for me when I was reading his book on the creation of the Jewish state. And he says that to create the Jewish state, we need people to move here who are people of intellect, enterprise, and have financial means. He specifically spoke about these three types of people. And he said it will be difficult. It will be challenging, but this is what's necessary. And it's strange because in today's day and age, speaking to Muslims who live in more affluent countries, when you try to make that case, it goes on deaf ears. And it's tough because they would say, we have more freedoms here. We have a better health services system here. We have a better education here. And yet when Uthman is mentioning the struggle, the challenge, it's constant in the time of the Crusaders. And it's not easy, but there are people within the community, within the society, who keep going, who keep persevering, who keep maintaining the idea and the izzah of Islam alive in that sense. For me, it's admirable to then see people I know in Quds who are doing that, who are holding that in that way, and listen to what they're saying. Listen carefully to what they're saying. Don't tell them what they need. Don't tell them the solutions of what they need. Listen to them. And what are the names they're mentioning? Salahuddin, Abdul Hamid al-Thani. They're mentioning where's Pakistan, where's Turkey. They're saying Allahu Akbar. Listen carefully to what they're saying, because what they're asking for, if it doesn't align with the sort of liberal values that we are now internalizing, will we abandon them? Will we abandon them in that sense that the only connection we have with these people is one based on humanity alone? And apart from that, if tomorrow, Allah forbid, that we don't like what they're calling for, that we're just going to let them hang in that sense. So in that sense, it's important to understand how in the region itself, you're starting to see that there is something taking place, at least, where it's so flagrant at this moment in time in regards to the abandonment. It's so flagrant in regards to what Trump wanted, in regards to the deal of the century, and it's so flagrant how people are being easily butchered in this way and their life means nothing, that if Muslims now don't wake up and say, hang on a minute, we need an alternative, then we're in trouble. And that's where we're at right now. The difference, I would say, the difference between the narrative that Uthman has given us and the current reality is that there seems to be at least a band of people who felt the need to do something. Whereas right now, that feels like it's not there yet. Uthman is correct in saying that on the popular level, you can see it bubbling under the surface. But on the political level, there's an abandonment of this. There's a sense of political pragmatism to some degree, and a fear of the way that, and this is why I said the colonization is just not physical, it's psychological. The fear of the inability to change your situation because this is the situation. And yet in what Uthman has presented, and even in the Ottoman context, when we start to see the changes like Fatih's conquest of Istanbul, there is a genuine belief that this is going to happen. There is a belief that we keep going. And there were the doubters and the naysayers, and they ignored them and they kept moving. And they will, milestone by milestone, will achieving their objectives. And then that happens. So in that sense, you have to believe it. You have to be convinced of that. And in that sense, at the moment, We have to, and this is where I liked what Uthman said, was there were ulama who were truth speakers. There were ulama who were holding people to account. There needs to be people of education, intellect, and the ulama in our communities who have to be truth speakers. They have to speak the truth, and they have to highlight to this new community, the new generation, these new young people, what it is that's at stake. And in that sense, going back to the idea of piety, that's important, because your disposition is not simply one of political activism or activism in the street. Once again, when I was teaching my students about Iqbal, what was interesting, we were talking about Iqbal today, and Iqbal says that when your heart is empty or devoid of Allah, it will be filled by something else. It will be filled by something else. But if you fill your heart with Allah, then everything that Allah expects from you would be manifested in your actions in terms of what you do. And in that sense, Islam does that for you. So in that sense, there is an expectation of not only piety, but competency, knowledge, activity, bravery, and then we keep moving, right? We keep going. And so we don't have a parallel like this in the Ottoman period, because when Quds lost, the state collapses. So we don't have that moment, that spark moment. But 100 years after the collapse of the Ottomans, you would hope that there can be a spark moment today. There can be a moment tomorrow. There can be a moment soon, and it can be very small, but it can give Muslims a sense of hope that, okay, you know what? The solution is in Islam. They have to believe that. And I say before, we believe in Islam, we don't trust it. Trust it, okay? And you know, it's layers and layers of foundations laid by people before you. And you don't want to be, I don't want to go down in history as in Islamic history as the Muslims, known as the Muslims who did nothing. These were the Muslims who did nothing. But the long 1400-year history we have, continuously ringing out names and peoples. And then there was a moment where they just did nothing. They were complaining about the different flavors of ice cream they can have at a local supermarket. Like it's not washing for me. So in that sense, I make this appeal to Uthman and myself and to those who are educators out there, that there is an expectation on us to actually try to rekindle these memories, to rekindle these ideas, to speak about them more and more. Because when we're talking about political narratives, political alternatives, new imaginations, it requires people to draw back from something in the past. And we have a huge treasure chest which we can pull from, which we can draw from, and it has to be relatable, and people need to see that. And so in that sense, it is important for us to remind people of what Muslims in the past have achieved. And as you know already, I said this a lot in terms of the Ottoman past, because the collapse of the Ottoman state, when I talk about this to many of my students, they get surprised because they don't even know of this. And some of these things are interesting because a lot of scholars and thinkers at the time were warning Muslims at that time, and the fear that they warned people of are manifesting right now. And so we need to find a new intellectual response. The intellectual responses of the last 50, 60 years haven't worked. It's fine. I don't want to just bury people of the past as if they achieved nothing. You build upon those foundations. But here we are in 2021. We're talking about a particular situation. We're Muslim. Alhamdulillah, we're still Muslim. And alhamdulillah, we're still here. And so we keep going. And there's no doubt in my mind that we can achieve something. We have to now we have to be men of history. You know, I was reading about Ibn Khaldun and I was just laughing because not only was he a historian, he was a man of history. That's what's interesting there. Do you know what I mean? So yeah. There's no reason why we can't be those people. No reason, you know. So we have to believe it to achieve it. And last point, in the 67 war, one of the interesting things that the Israelis managed to do regarding the Arabs and when they defeated them, is they made them believe that you're never gonna defeat us. You're not as good as us. We are far more superior to you. And this propaganda and this sort of like psychological pressure that they put, it manifested. And we have to ask ourselves that, look, we want a different world that we live in right now. And the way that the world is operating right now, this is my personal belief, the West have had free reign in the last 100 years to do what they wanted, and they trashed it. they absolutely trashed it. They have nothing to be proud of. When people are telling me they're proud to be American, I'm like, what are you proud of? You were the first people who used the nuke. You were the people who had a society that was built on slavery. You removed the Native Americans. You were the people who invaded Iraq, invaded Afghanistan, trashed the place. You gave sex, drugs, rock and roll, and burgers to people. What have you given anyone that you can be proud of? In that sense, as Muslims, like,
prostitution isn't
we
bad,
have
right?
to. Okay, but we need to, we need to now ask ourselves, not feel so inferior. We have a rich culture that we can draw from and say, okay, the world is still here. We're still here. We still exist. Let's go again, and let's try to provide people alternatives. And I think that's important, that the scholars of the past, they were thinking all the time. They had their fingers on the pulse. And their fingers on the pulse were not simply, I'm going to see in my lifetime. It was, okay, even if I die, the word continues. And that's important. So we need people to write. Writing is important, so it leaves an imprint, a memory. We're still reading Ghazali. There's something about that that's important. The Quran is a book that you memorize, and it's also a book that's written. It's important. So we need more people in this ummah to invest in writing, that intellectual component. Don't think that that's secondary in that sense. Okay, so yeah.
Dr. Uthman, Dr. Yaqoob, I think, has given a massive amount of food for thought, a banquet, so to speak. But what I sort of want to come in on that, and I think we can link in and maybe finish off in the next 20 minutes as well, is a strange occurrence that happened. I don't know if you saw this, it went viral, is Mark Ruffalo, the Hulk in the Avengers, who came out in support of the Palestinians, and suddenly when the going got rough, the Hulk was not so hulky, and he decided that he was going to backtrack, and he sort of abandoned the Palestinian cause. And one of the things that a lot of Muslims have taken from that is that secular liberalism, with all of its quote unquote virtues, will not provide us the solution. That the systems that are in place, the United Nations, the resolutions, all of these things, they have not given us Palestine. Quds is still under threat. It is more under threat than it has ever been. And it's a very sort of sad and tragic situation that we're seeing in front of us, that we can't look like the leftist alliances that we've made and all of that. They're not going to provide us. And if they want to give us Quds, they'll give it on their terms. And that's even more dangerous. And so that's something I think Dr. Yaqoob has come in very beautifully there, that if Quds is to be taken and is to be liberated, it has to be done on our terms and on terms of Muslim and being Muslims. And I think that links us to Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahimahullah ta'ala, the last man to liberate Quds, who did it on his own terms, who did it based on the efforts of a social, cultural, religious movement inspired by Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah ta'ala, Imam Abdul Qadir al-Jili, rahimahullah ta'ala, and all of these people, and then what he did there himself and the competency he showed. What lessons do we take in the modern age, bearing in mind that we want to take our guidance and inspiration from Islam, and maybe even if we could tie in maybe Salahuddin Ayyubi, rahimahullah ta'ala, and his efforts. You're unmuted. You're muted, Dr. Uthman. You'll have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Bismillah. Jazakallah khair. There's a lot, alhamdulillah, here that, of course, Dr. Yaqoob mentioned a lot of very important things. One of my favorite lines, in fact, from Iqbal is when Iqbal said that, one sajda to Allah will save you from 1,000 sajdas to everything else, right? So everybody, in fact, is in servitude to something or somebody else. You mentioned the point about this individual, the Hulk, Rafal, or whatever his name is. One of the way that we define courage is not just shiddatul qalb, not just the strength of the heart, but it's defined as shiddatul qalb fil ba's. It's the strength of the heart in difficulty, in hardship, right? In turmoil, the strength of the heart in that sense. And I think, therefore, that one of the things that we're speaking about in these historical narratives, there are so many examples of paradigms of resistance, paradigms of courage, paradigms of bravery, who put the concern of the ummah before their own concerns, and that's reflected in both an individual sense and also in terms of a political unity. So, for example, Nuruddin Zengi, like I mentioned before, was somebody who was very, he didn't have that much. He didn't live with that much because he realized that the Ummah's concerns are bigger than he is. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, they would ask him, why don't you take a house? And he would say that if a person is looking for martyrdom, why would a person want a house? They would say about him that he would say, Ibn Shaddad is said, he would say, كيف يطيب لي الفرح والطعام ولذة المنام وبيت المقدس بأيدي الصليبيين. How would it please me to eat good food and have good drinks when Jerusalem is in the hands of the Crusaders? He was like كانك الوالد الثكلى. He was like a bereaved mother. That's how he felt, that the fact that Al-Quds was in the hands of the Crusaders, like a bereaved mother, right? And he would take his horse from place to place and he would shout out and say, Ya lil Islam, oh to Islam, oh to Islam. And there was a genuine sense of anxiety, the genuine sense of outrage, the fact that there's something that's so colossal in magnitude, the fact that the first Qibla is in the hands of the Crusaders, became a stable for horses. I mean, this disrespect that's being shown towards that. That genuine sense of outrage, was very apparent in those early models. And I think that we have to encapsulate that sense of genuine sense of response, a genuine sense of real feeling for the fact that that land is a land that Allah has blessed. It's a land under occupation. Muslims are occupied. Our holy precincts are also occupied. And in the course of all of this, what's prevailing? Dhulm, injustice. Now remember, of course, Allah made us, Allah wanted us to be paragons, of justice. Allah in the Quran says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُ الشُّهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. And then the ayah continues. Imam Qurtubi says about this ayah, فَقَدْ كَانَ الْعَدْلِ مِنْ أَهَمَّ يَجِبْ عَلَى هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ. When Allah says that we made you, a middle nation, so you can be, witnesses to people, Qurtubi says that it means that it's showing that justice becomes one of the most important obligations upon this entire ummah, to ensure justice, in our world. Allah made us this. Allah created us for this purpose, to be advocates of justice in our world. I did a speech at a demonstration in Slough just on the weekend, and I began speaking about historical ironies. And I said, isn't it so ironic that on May the 9th, when there was so much happening in the news stories of Sheikh Jarrah, May the 9th was the centennial of Sophia Scholl. If you follow my work, I write about her as well. Sophia Scholl was that young 21-year-old who was part of the White Rose movement in Nazi Germany. Her centennial, she was born May the 9th, 1921. And it was a centennial that the world celebrated, in fact, ironically, in Israel itself, in America, in Europe, in Germany. Sophia Scholl was named by Der Spiegel as being the greatest German woman in German history, right? Because of the work that she did in campaigning against the theft and removal of Jews from their homes in Germany. And I thought, look at the crazy historical irony that here we have on the centennial of Sophia Scholl, the fact that Muslims are being removed from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah on the very same day as her centennial. The thing that she gave her life, she was put under the guillotine on February 22nd, 1943. She was killed by the Nazis, but that's what she gave her life to ensuring, therefore, that tyranny would not prevail under Nazism in Germany. I think, therefore, we have to have this sense of courage and bravery of speaking truth to power. Dr. Yaqoob mentioned this point about not being afraid. The Prophet, there's a beautiful hadith from Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, when he says that, Awsani Khalili bi sab'a, that my Khalil gave me 7 pieces of advice. Yeah. And he says that he commanded me, Amarani bi hubb al-masakin, he commanded me to love the poor. Commanded me to love the poor. Think about that. Commanded me to love the poor, to be with the poor, to help the poor, to be with the dispossessed, to be with the disenfranchised, to be with that community, to be close to them. Amarani, right? And asl al-rahim, commanded me to join ties of kinship. Right? Be people who create and build and bridge, and not to those who burn bridges and destroy things in society, bridge between people. He commanded me to speak the truth, وَإِن كَانَ مُرًّا, even if it's bitter. وَنَقُولَ الْحَقِّ وَإِن كَانَ مُرًّا, speak the truth even if it's bitter, but speak the truth. Commanded me, أَن لَا أَخَافُ فِي اللَّهِ لَوْمَةَ لَائِمٍ, not to fear, for the sake of Allah, the blame of the blamer, not to fear the blame of the blamer, right? And others, and to increase. But the last advice he gave is وَأَنْ أَكْثَرْ مِنْ قَوْلِ لَا حَوْلَ وَلَا قُوَّةَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ, right? Increase in my saying of there's no power and might except with Allah, right? Because if you really believe this, your aqeedah, you really believe this, that means all things happen with the permission of Allah, and all things happen as a test to see how we're going to navigate, how we're going to react and respond to these instances, these occurrences, and these things can happen, right? And so therefore this is a reminder for all of us. There is a big point in both Nuruddin Zengi and Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, which was a point about the fact that Sham was divided. Syria was divided between Aleppo and Damascus, right? And they both realized that, unless there is unity in our landscapes, in our political body, it's the Crusaders are going to have so many more chances, right, at taking our territories and expanding their territories and their rule. So we have to fix that problem of disunity in the Ummah. We have to do something. Now, of course, remember that from the works of Al-Ghazali, and this is seeping through, and the Nizamiya madrasas are making use of this, and there's more sense of calmness that was not there in the 10th century, like in Baghdad and other places, between the Atharis and the Asharis and all this kind of nonsense between them, kind of hyperbolic ta'assub between them. There was a sense of calm, peace. This is why in Salah ad-Din's army, why do we have soldiers from, like you mentioned, Maqadis, and Maqadis settled in Salahiyah, in Damascus, that became their district, the Salahiyah district. And there is kind of an exchange of knowledge and ideas and information that's taking place at this time. And like you mentioned, some people are traveling to Abdul Qadir al-Jalani, for example, coming back and teaching, and this is kind of transfer is taking, but it's happening with more of a sense of respect that wasn't there, or was not so much there in the early century, and so therefore this is extremely important. Sorry, I keep getting distracted by my daughter. Sorry. This is important. Now, therefore, the idea was that there has to be a sense of unity. I'll tell you something about Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. He had 16 children, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, rahimahullah. 16 children, right? And as a man, therefore, is so concerned with retaking Jerusalem, he still had a family, 16 kids. And so they said about him, كان في أكثر أوقات فراغه بين أولاده الصغار لا يعلو على الناس ولا يطلب العلو. He says that most of his free time he would spend with his children. He would not exalt himself, and nor would he seek exaltation. Now that's his example. Look at the example of the first conqueror of Al-Quds, Umar radiallahu anhu. Once, Sayyidina Umar, when he was Khalifa radiallahu anhu, he was playing with his kids. It says, وَالصِّبْيَانِ يَلَعْبُونَ الْبَطْنِ. His kids are playing on his stomach, and one of his governors comes in, and وَأَنْكَرَ هَذَا الْفِعْلِ. He didn't like what Umar was doing, because he expected, the Khalif to be like, brawny and full of discipline and everything. And Umar gets up, and Umar asks him, كيف أنت في أهلك? How are you with your family? And the man says, إذا دخلت لا يتكلم أحد. When I enter, no one speaks. When I enter my house, no one's allowed. It's like lockdown, no one's allowed to speak, And Umar says to him, he says, you're removed from your position as governor. Why? إذا لم ترفق في أهلك كيف ترفق في أمة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. If you cannot show kindness to your family, how can you show kindness to the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? I mean, these are the principles that they lived by. People like Omar, people like Nuruddin, people like Salahuddin as examples for all of us. And so therefore the idea of unity was very essential, to unify Sham, put good between the governors of Aleppo and Damascus, and therefore now that's strength against the Crusaders, that's strength. But at the same time, to realize there are internal enemies. Internal enemies have to be isolated, right? They have to be isolated. In that time, of course, you had the Fatimids, And even though, like Nuruddin spent time working with the Fatimids before, the governors did also, there was that kind of sense of realization, because they're in control of Egypt. Egypt is so powerful. The ports of Damietta, for example, and this is such a powerful place. If you have control of Egypt, you have control of Al-Quds. This was a realization. But when they began to betray the Muslims, backstab the Muslims, ally with the Crusaders against the Muslims, right? You're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff happening today, allying with the enemies against the Muslims. He realized there has to be an end to that. Even though he had sent, Salahuddin to reinstate Shawar, the governor, After that, a betrayal all over again. It had to be end game, for that, and that's exactly what happened. So I think therefore the idea of political unity is very, very, very essential, for the Muslims. I think at the same time, of course, so therefore the three, you might say, 3 points of Nur ad-Din's resistance, you might say, would be the idea of unification of Asham, or would be the defeat of the Fatimids, and then this idea of instilling in the hearts and minds of the Muslims the idea of wanting to recapture Beit al-Maqdis, to make them realize the importance of what's happening there and what needs to happen there as well. Salah ad-Din continued this model, that he inherited really, or was taught from Nur ad-Din Zengi as well. And I think that therefore, as Dr. Yaqoob was saying, this is not a time for anyone to be apathetic. History remembers, whenever if you have people who have genocidal tendencies, if you have genocides, you always have 4 groups of people that emerge. You would have the perpetrators, you would have the victims, you would have the bystanders, and you would have the rescuers. We're speaking about rescuing and rescuers, people who have these principles embodied in themselves of courage, of principle, of discipline, right, of empathy, right, of mercy. Remember, Islam is the deen of rahmah, right? So if Nabi Sallam was a mercy for all the worlds, rahmatul alameen, right, that means that you can't tolerate injustice, you can't tolerate massacres and killings and subjugation and vilification and dehumanization and oppression and apartheid on a people. That's counter to rahmah, that's counter to mercy, right? So therefore the principle would be that we're motivated because we are people of mercy, and we won't tolerate injustice against anybody else because that's counter to mercy. Remember that Muslims also rescued Jews in the Holocaust, right? That's another thing. They also rescued Jews in the Holocaust. You have a very good book by Robert Satloff called Among the Righteous, and it speaks about the Arabs, who did things. The people of Albania had this code of the Bisa, rescued countless Jews in the Holocaust. You have the people of North Africa when the Nazis invaded, who rescued so many Jews in the Holocaust. Amazing stories of courage and resistance and bravery. So Muslims always have kind of abided by these principles of justice seeking and assistance and so on and so forth, and that even extended, in fact, to the Jews, before, even in their most difficult and dire moments of the Holocaust. And so I think that, finally, that if there are some lessons we can learn from examples of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and Nur al-Zengi and the Ottoman Empire, like Dr. Hugh mentioned for us, there has to be in this time a realization that this is not just about what happened now with Sheikh Jarrah or the bombardment on those innocent victims in Gaza, right? May Allah accept them as martyrs and have mercy on their souls. But this is something that is for us a continued struggle, right? We don't want to be apathetic. My final advice, there's always a danger. I mentioned to you Stefan Hassel, yeah? So Stefan Hassel, who authored Time for Outrage, and he mentioned his final sentence in his book. I memorized his final sentence years ago when I read the book. I thought it's so powerful. You know what he says? He says in his final sentence, he says, "We call for a mass public uprising against the means of mass communication that offer nothing but mass consumption as a prospect for our youth, general amnesia, and the outrageous competition of all against all." And the idea would be, therefore, if we're so fixated with the things of this world, and you're so fixated with the fads and this and that, you would have no time for Palestine. You would have no time for China. You would have no time for Myanmar. You wouldn't have any time for this, because our hearts are elsewhere and not where they're supposed to be. And that's what the danger is. There's dangers, therefore, that there's going to be there could be mental buffers, like mental buffers. If I said, for example, to an Englishman, what happened in 1966, it's likely he would say that's when, like, you guys love football, and you guys would obviously say that's when England won the World Cup, isn't it? But if I asked an Indonesian what happened, he'd say that's the year when 1 million of our people was slaughtered, right? In 1966, in General Suharto, in the anti-communist purge funded by America, up to 1 million people were slaughtered in 1966. If I ask what happened in 1969 to the Americans, they'd say that's the time when we landed on the moon. But 1968 was the My Lai massacre against the Vietnamese, and by the time that story reached the news, it was 1969. But by that time, people are celebrating, and they have no time for these negative, bad stories. So we don't want to be we don't want to be of those who have this sense of media fatigue, compassion fatigue. For us, it's about moral compassion. Needs to be, moral consistency, for the sake of Allah, and to remember to have courage and say, therefore, we're speaking about historical accounts. These are historical moments where the political unity, the political structure of Islam is shown to be so effective. If that model can incorporate justice for Muslims and Jews and Christians and unify the body, right, then we should have confidence in asserting the fact that we have a model that worked, right, in human history. That's the one that we have to promote in our time, and have courage, in doing that. Ameen. Jazakumullah khairan. I want to thank both of you again, for inviting me, and of course for sharing the time with Dr. Yaqoob. It's been really wonderful. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallah feek. I don't know if you need to leave, Dr. Uthman, and that's why.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, that's fine, inshallah. If you need to go, that's fine, and I'll close off with Dr. Yaqoob, inshallah. Jazakallah khair for your time. Inshallah, we hope. I mean, you're in Slough, so you're literally just around the corner. So inshallah, we will host you at some point soon, inshallah, in High Wycombe before soon. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Jazakallah for your time, and inshallah, I hope to see you soon.
Inshallah, shukran. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
So it's just me and you, Dr. Yaqoob. And I guess we will just try to come to a close at this point as well. I don't know if you want to just go riff off what Dr. Uthman left with, but I guess, there's a question here from Isma on Sticks, which is a very creative name, about this idea of, there's an idea of helplessness, there's an idea of despair, and you spoke about inferiority, assumptions of inevitability that sort of become embedded within the Muslim psyche, and in a sense, what can we do? Even Dr. Uthman spoke about, when the first crusade happened, people started cursing the Crusaders, but that wasn't going to get rid of them. We do our protests, and we can protest as much as we want, but that might get us a ceasefire potentially, but that's not going to fix. The protest can't be the solution. And so if we're going to, and I guess this is a very open-ended discussion that could take 2 hours on its own, but if you had to then, in the modern age, as Muslims, with the idea of what we're seeing around the world, and I love how Dr. Uthman in his closing remarks sort of very, very strong insinuations towards the Khilafah. That's basically what he was talking about there. That there was a Khilafah once, that was the model, that succeeded, that was the protector and the bulwark against some of the greatest travesties, against the enemies of Islam. That is no longer there. So now what we have is open border policy, that people can come into Islamic lands, do what they want, and we have traitors within our midst. All of these things Dr. Uthman mentioned. With all of that in mind, as in a sense, closing remarks, what are our possible solutions? What can we do as individuals, as even non-intellectuals, as community organizations, as people? Even scarier, I guess, is us living in the West, who, for us, we have to navigate this linguistic maze where we can't say certain things. We've had to be very careful in the conversation we've had today, that there are certain things that could be misconstrued very easily. You could end up, like some people might, in the pages of the Daily Mail. And may Allah protect our brothers and sisters from the heinous attacks of the malicious media. But these are things that are very feasible now in the age we live in of mass communication. So bearing all of that in mind, what would you suggest?
My answer to that question is, what can we not do? It's not what can we do, it's what can we not do. There's so much we can do. I'll be honest, when people were demonstrating years ago, I would have been quite critical of that, the demonstrations. And I'll give you an example. In the 1930s, there was frustration within the Palestinian population for 15 years. 15 years of congresses, demonstration, and futile meddling. And instead, the British still gave away the lands to the occupiers in that sense. There was divisions amongst the political elites, and no consensus could be met. what you start to see here is, for a long time, the Ottomans were promoting this idea of Ittihad al-Islam, Muslim unity, the unity within the Islamic umbrella. The problem was that a lot of the language that was being promoted at the time during the Young Turk period was symbolic, was rhetorical, was sloganistic. You had a word like freedom, which could mean multiple things to multiple people. It was useful because it was vague. It helped because it could work as a way of galvanizing people. But the problem is that when it came to having to intellectualize this term so that it can have some meaning for people, nobody knew what it meant. Nobody knew what it meant. So what you start to realize is, in a world where slogans, rhetoric, they work as exceptional political tools in the modern period. But what is required now is people to sit down and offer with bravery alternatives to the current situation we're in. And in that sense, I've always proposed this, is that we need to have Muslims to have the ability to have alternative imaginations, irrespective of what those imaginations are, and not feel embarrassed about it. Not feel embarrassed that you're going to be critiqued, that your imaginations of a better future are going to come from Islam. That means that you have to turn to Islam and look in Islam to see where the answers are. And I mentioned Iqbal earlier because I was teaching in the morning. What I found interesting is he said, when people were leaving Islam, because at that time there was this obsession with science and Freemasonic activity and so forth, he was making the argument, when people were leaving Islam because they critiqued Islam as being inefficient for the time, he said it wasn't the inefficiency of Islam, it was the inefficiency in the person who never understood Islam in the first place. It was the inefficiency in them. And so what they projected was their own inefficiency. And we don't need you. You can go, because this ummah is better off without you. In that sense, going back to the demonstrations, what the demonstrations are telling me is that this younger generation, as Uthman has mentioned, has an emotion, has an empathy, has a feeling, wants to feel connected. And what the demonstrations tell me is there is a helplessness because nobody else is doing anything. And so people feel the need to do it themselves. They feel so frustrated that there is no sort of like leadership. There is a deficiency in the leadership stakes. There's a deficiency in the intellectual stakes. There's a deficiency in terms of truth speakers, that people are being forced to go to the streets themselves. And even though they cannot give you a solution, they want to do something. As a result of that, rather than criticizing that activity, what I'm saying is, let me see what that activity means. There is something that is telling us. And what it's telling us is that the youth still have something in them. Now, what's important is those of us who are people of tradition, of knowledge, of culture, we now need to help these young people to cultivate that. We need to cultivate Islam in people. We need to put in the graft. We need to put in the hard work. We need to sacrifice. This dunya is very temporary. I can say this to all the people out there. The older I'm getting, I'm really realizing I don't have much time left in this dunya. It's really short. I don't know where my life has gone, and it's gone so fast. And as a result of it, every single iota of my life is spent on giving back to Muslims in the hope that Allah will be pleased with me. As a result of that, your mission should not be individual-centered. It should be Allah-centered. Please Allah. I always say, if you seek validation from people, it leads to a sense of narcissism, which is very prevalent in society today, or an inadequacy. But if you seek validation from Allah, it always leads to humility. And you're always striving. You're always trying to work towards progression to try to please your Lord. We have, I was telling my students at the moment, we have two forms of ignorance. We have the ignorance in the West, which is the rejection of Allah. And then we have the ignorance in the Muslim world, which is the misapplication of Islam. Both of them are equally destructive. One is a sense of ignorance because it just rejects outright, which means when we talk about humanity, in Islam, to be insan means to recognize the one who created insan. To deny that leads to a sense of ignorance, because it leads to a sense of not understanding what humanity is then. Because to understand what humanity is to understand the one that created the human. the one that created humanity, the one that gave you your soul, which you reject, the one that gave you your nafs, which you reject, the one that gave you aql, which you reject. So not only do you reject the one who created, you then reject every other manifestation of what it means to be insan. Then what is your humanity left with? Your humanity is left with is nothing but raw emotion and hypocrisy. In that sense, the argument that Islam somehow has nothing to offer regarding the idea of one's humanity is very flawed in that sense. And the problem I also have with this idea of humanity, that this is a human issue, it's not a human issue, because that's like saying all lives matter. By reducing it, by saying humanity is the meta paradigm and Islam is an idea which just creates division, is incorrect. In reality, listens to the Palestinians, Islam is ingrained in their fiber. To reduce that, to remove that, to reject that component in them about what makes them who they are is a huge injustice in regards to their call. And to take that out of them and to suggest that we are going to tell you what your call ought to be, and it should be one of humanity. Well, then what have you done for humanity so far? Your call for humanity has done what? Did it stop the killing in the Rohingya? Did it stop the killing in China? Did it stop the killing in Rwanda? Has it stopped the killing for the Palestinians? Speak to the Syrians. They gave up on the international order and humanity a long time ago because they were expecting you to come and save them. You didn't. So in that sense, then the appeal to Muslims is, okay, look,
I guess humanity only works when you're a Belarusian activist.
Look, you know, what's his name? George Orwell. He said something which always sticks in my mind, which is all animals are equal, except some animals are more equal than others. And you can't, when you speak to Muslims, you can feel they have that sense of what that means. So the appeal that this is just a human issue is not. Don't reduce it to just a human issue, because you strip it away from its intellectual component. You strip it away from its cultural component. You strip it away from its political component. You strip all those facets away from the Palestinian by telling them that the only thing you are is human, like the rest of us, which then means nothing. It has no real meaning, because there's an assumption that we inherently know what's the right thing to do. That's not the way it works. So as Muslims, we are saying that we have an alternative where we can safeguard humanity, that we have an idea that humanity is sick. It's mentally sick, it's spiritually sick, it's trashing the environment, it's politically sick, it has no alternatives. As Muslims, then, we need to provide first these ideas within our communities, so that they understand what we have is something that should be cherished, something that provides something to this dunya and the akhirah, something that's fully comprehensive, and something that worked in the past. It did happen where it was what people made mistakes, but it was there. There was a system that was working, which was an alternative to the world that we have right now. And there's no shame in asking for that alternative again. There's no shame in that. And so Muslims have to be brave, and they have to be bold enough to start speaking within their communities of asking, like, what is it that we can do? And to reduce, as I said, Islam just to religion, just to ibadat, to reduce the Muslim just to that is a huge injustice to what Islam is. Because as in Malaysia, when I was in Malaysia, Yaqoob Al-Thas, he said Islam was a comprehensive worldview about life. It was comprehensive in all matters in regards to this dunya and the akhirah. To reject that, to strip that away, reduces insan in a very violent way to something. And this is what's happening to humanity. So in the end of the day, what's interesting is when we read about Salahuddin, what's interesting about what Dr. Uthman said was that people only see Salahuddin as the fighter, the soldier, the mujahid. And here he's explaining Salahuddin the pious man, Salahuddin the religious man, Salahuddin the father. He humanized him in a way to understand Salahuddin, the one who represented Islam in all of these facets. This is necessary for us to understand that. And I think in that sense, we have to be the embodiment of Islam. Those of us who call for it, we have to be persistent. We have to be consistent. We have to be brave. We have to be pious. We have to be religious. We have to fast as much as we can. We have to pray as much as we can. We have to internalize the Quran. We need to support our communities, support our families, and support the Ummah. We are people of service. We are not individuals that serve ourselves only. And you can see then when Umar bin Khattab is critiquing the governor, it's because he's thinking, if you can't be of service to your family, How are you going to be a service to the Ummah? This is what Islam teaches us. It's not about me, 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 me. The minute it becomes Allah-centered, this is what becomes important. So now, the advice I give to all of you out there, I can't speak for Dr. Uthman, but I can speak for myself. I believe you are better than me. I believe that when I see young people, they have so much endeavor, they have motivation, they have energy, they have fight. They can do fantastic things. They can do better things than us. They can have a better future, or they can achieve a future for Muslims in the future that can be better. They need to start working for it and not be occupied by this. Don't keep working now and get the groundwork going, you know. So this is what I hope, and this is what I believe. I think I've spoken too much today. I'm very emotional, and I apologize for that. But yeah, inshallah, you know, inshallah, that I see a resolution in regards to the Aqsa. But if I don't, we keep going. We keep planting the seeds. We keep going.
100%, 100%. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Yaqoob. May Allah reward you immensely for all the time that you always give us, and the extreme and immense benefit we take from you. And I think that as a closing guidance, I think that's very powerful. I think there's a very strong, especially within the youth of our community. For I don't know if people, you know, Wickham-based people are watching. We here at the Karima Foundation, we're more than ready to take on people of service. We need people of service within our communities. We know the state of our communities. We live here. We can see a lot of the challenges and difficulties and hardships that we see on a daily basis on our streets, in our homes. And if people are willing to volunteer and come forward, then bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, come forward for the sake of the Ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, because it is by service of the smaller community that we will strengthen ourselves to be able to be of service to the greater community of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. I mean, it's been an incredible conversation, and I hope people have taken immense benefit from it. I just want to close now by thanking Dr. Yaqoob, as usual, for his incredible insights and his wisdom. He's like the perfect, you know, the charisma is just, I was just thinking, it's like the intellectual strength is there, subhanAllah, that's been so beneficial to me in my studies this year. I'm doing postgraduate studies in economic history, and I have to say Dr. Yaqoob has been incredibly helpful to me in readings and in guidance and in resources. And then on top of that, just the mentoring and the spiritual upliftment and the psychological confidence. It's just really, he gives you confidence as a Muslim that Izzah is there within your faith, and you are a person of Izzah, whether they like you or not. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, we have ennobled Bani Adam, and so whatever they can do and try to do to disgrace you is irrelevant, because your Izzah is there by virtue of connection to Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam and the Lord of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So once again, Jazakallah Dr. Yaqoob, may Allah reward you, may Allah increase you. I ask all of our listeners to make dua for Dr. Yaqoob, that Allah Ta'ala bless him, increase him in his efforts, bless him and his family, that Allah Ta'ala allows him to visit High Wycombe once again, inshallah ta'ala. If you're ever back home in the blessed land of Tooting, then if you could drop us, we would love to host you once again, Dr. Yaqoob, inshallah. And we brought him last time. He spoke about Sultan Abdul Hamid, and we took him to a Turkish restaurant. He'd come from Turkey, and we took him to a Turkish restaurant. Subhanallah. So inshallah, we'll take you again. And for all other people who are watching, you know, spread the word, let people know about other programs. We have more things planned, inshallah, coming up. Inshallah, then there might be a reading. There's a good chance we'll do a reading on 40 hadith on the virtues of Quds with Mullah Yusuf Shabir. That's in the pipeline, inshallah, like Dr. Sheikh Uthman Lateef mentioned about the virtues of Quds, how important it is. We've got some programs lined up with Dr. Jonathan Brown coming up. So keep your eyes and ears open. There's another program, inshallah, commemoration of Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri that we will do, inshallah, with Dr. Yaqoob soon in the next few months as well, inshallah. So a lot of things in the pipeline. And then just stuff happening. We've got Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu starting again in High Wycombe. This idea of being physically strong as an ummah as well, that the Prophet ﷺ was a physically strong man. Kana ashja' an-nas, he was the most brave of people. These are things that are incredibly important as well. So just check out the Karima Foundation website or the social media pages for everything. And may Allah bless you all. And inshallah ta'ala, we pray that Allah ta'ala makes this a means of the liberation.
Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya Allah, Ya الله يا الله يا لطيف يا لطيف يا لطيف يا الله يا لطيف يا لطيف يا لطيف يا الله يا الله يا الله يا الله يا الله